Chapter 789. Less than an inch away from the sharp icicles, a network of silver lines extending from the ice surface appeared behind Brando. The definition of a wall in the law was to separate the inside from the outside, and it also had the meaning of stopping. Brando landed heavily on the equidistant grid formed by the silver lines, and the corresponding force was transmitted back from the law wall. He used this force to roll back, and at least he did not fall into the frozen earth domain. At the same time, the silver lines bent downward, absorbing the huge impact when he landed. Then a clear and bright voice appeared in the biting cold wind. In the name of the law, wall, tension, protection, Terathos, scepter, lightning, counterattack. A 5-foot-tall, 5-foot-wide force-field shaped shield appeared in front of Brando, and at the same time, a lightning bolt tore through the fog condensed by the frost, making a sizzling sound. It was like a long golden snake, snaking towards Sabers, who was standing in the center of the frozen earth domain. However, the Frost Night King was unmoved, and with a casual pull, he tore the lightning beam into pieces. He raised his head, and the frost mist dissipated, revealing the floating figure behind him. The young wizard floating in midair, the Shire. As early as the battle in Ampere Seal, Brando had been studying ways to fight against the ultimate domain. After the Planeswalker card was displayed, it would be connected to the Planeswalker according to the law. Once it was blocked, there was almost no other way to summon it back to his side except for the daily reset time. Therefore, the idea of making Planeswalker cards came into being at that time, as a secondary thing that was separated from Brando. Authority. In the law, there was no doubt that the Planeswalker card was regarded as a part of Brando's body. Therefore, Brando could summon any set of Planeswalker cards to his side at any time, regardless of the distance, the boundary of vision, or even vice versa. In other words, if Brando wanted to, he could even leave the ultimate domain at any time. But that was meaningless. He knew that he could only get the reward of the mission if he defeated Sabers here. He knew very well what it might be. The Frost Night King's silver-white eyes showed a hint of surprise. After the fog parted, what he saw wasn't the Planeswalker card holding a silver staff and wearing a patterned white robe, the Shire of the silver-robed wizard. Instead, it was the man who had returned to 1,000 years ago, and was crowned as the dragon of the world. Darkness. However, one of them was facing him while the other had his back. Sabers, can you see the future of this land? Frost Night King, thank you for your hospitality, but it's my turn to attack now. The two voices intertwined and echoed in his ears. Sabers almost squinted his eyes, and a phosphorescence quietly burned in his eyes. Different answers, but the same ability and presence, the same destiny and pursuit. He could even remember that terrifying power. When the organization still existed, the scene of the 13 Supreme Managers fighting with unknown enemies on the ancient battlefield was still clear as if it was a memory from yesterday. It's just that the presence of this young man in front of him was different from anyone he had seen before. It was neither Odin, the commander of the Legion, nor Kingston of the Judgment Sword. It was different from anyone. Could there be other Supreme Managers in this world? But there was no time for him to think. Brando borrowed the power of the silver net and charged toward him. At the same time, the Shire that was summoned floating in the sky was chanting a new spell. It was a sonorous draconic word filled with magic, and the pressure was like a sharp claw that pierced through the restless space. Sabers saw all of this. After experiencing thousands of battles, these were just insignificant skills in his eyes. He felt like he could easily resolve the situation in his heart with just a wave of his hand, but he still looked at the scene with interest, as if he was enjoying the process of something interesting sprouting. Maybe this is that person, he thought to himself. Sparks flew in all directions as Halran Gaia landed heavily on the spine of the Frost Chant's sword. He was shocked because he did not even see when Sabers moved. It was faster than he thought by a hair's breadth. The next moment, 5 blazing golden red lines had bypassed him and stabbed at Sabers' back like a sharp dagger. This wasn't a flame formed by the gathering of elements, it was purely a high temperature. It was the law of golden lines, heat, high temperature and motion. The Shire's voice was still as sharp as a sword. The golden red flames hit the back of the Frost Night King. Brando could even see the rising flames and sparks, but to his disappointment, Sabers was unmoved. The pale white damage number that was projected on his retina was a huge 0. It couldn't break through his defense. How did this guy's defense suddenly increase so much? Sabers turned his head, and his eyes were filled with anger. White's phosphorescence was a stark contrast to the uneasiness in his heart, and he almost suffocated. My lord, I feel that the law has been frozen by him. The Shire reminded him hurriedly through telepathy. The Frost Night King has this ability? Brando felt a chill in his heart and quickly avoided his opponent's gaze. He used the 9 luminary sword art to wander around, trying to find a suitable opportunity to cut in. Unfortunately, Sabers at this moment acted like a seasoned swordsman, waiting for Brando's last strike. This made him feel a little discouraged. In fact, at this moment, Brando already had the intention to retreat. He had experienced many battles and understood that there were some chances in battle, but there were other battles where there was no chance of winning. As a wise player or a swordsman at this moment, he should know when to choose to retreat. He decided to fight for the last time. The Shire's law of protection was still on him. If this attack didn't succeed, he would let Hipamera, Faith Deck, the Shire's priest card, pull him and the Shire out of the polar plane. Unexpectedly, at this moment, Sabers suddenly spoke again. With a soft sound, he used the soul detainer Fingus in his hand to block Brando's sword. Then the heavy and hoarse voice asked, "Young man, I'm curious. What is the purpose of your pursuit of power?" Brando was slightly startled, but he subconsciously thought that this was just a way for the opponent to distract him. He pondered for a moment and did not respond. In the blink of an eye, 2 or 3 swords clashed. You may not understand this. Only when you understand the meaning of Odin's inheritance can I pass it to you without worry. This time Brando was finally moved. He blocked Sabers' sword and quickly asked, "What are you trying to say, respected Frost Night King?" "I'm saying that this power contains the tip of the iceberg of a secret. You may have vaguely guessed it, but only those who truly accept it may be qualified to obtain the final inheritance of the Dark Dragon." While the two were answering, their hands were not slow at all. The 3 long swords crisscrossed like lightning. On the surface, Brando was constantly retreating. He could not help but grit his teeth. At least in terms of swordsmanship, he found that he could not gain the slightest advantage over the opponent. Sabers' sword was becoming more and more skillful. It was as if the Frost Night King was just teasing him. Finally, he found a gap and said, "Secret? You mean the secret behind the Battle of the Holy Saints? The truth?" The soul fire in Sabers' eyes suddenly lit up. He suddenly withdrew his sword, giving Brando a chance to breathe. "You are smarter than I thought, young man." This actually had nothing to do with being smart, because for the Battle of the Holy Saints, Brando's understanding of the war was no less than the 2 present, Sabers and Saint Tossel, the Wind Empress. And as a bystander, he might even see it more clearly. Although there were many mysteries in the Battle of the Holy Saints, Brando thought that perhaps there was no deep reason behind it. The Myrnas were arrogant and overbearing day after day, and they had no end to the Silver people. The oppression eventually led to war, and the flames of this war burned across the entire continent. The sages led their ancestors through the dark wilderness, and the people of the Silver race were scattered across the land, was a reference to this period of history. However, the Bugas and the Mist Elves eventually won, and they established the order after the War of the Holy Saints. It was just that the Black Iron race took advantage of the situation to rise. This was the official setting, and it could not be overturned. Brando took advantage of the moment when Sabers withdrew his sword to support the Halran Gaia on the silver grid, gasping for breath. But he raised his head and couldn't help but ask, "Do you want to say that the 4 holy saints covered up the truth, and that the dark dragon Odin was actually the righteous side in the Battle of the Holy Saints?" His tone was not trusting, which made Saint Tossel, the Wind Empress, who was quietly watching the battle, a little curious. In her impression, Brando was different from the Flame Empress. The other people under the rule of the Holy Cathedral, when he talked about her crew and the other 3, although there was respect in his tone, there was no reverence in his heart, which was completely different from those brainwashed believers. But at this moment, Brando's tone was undoubtedly on their side. Although Saint Tossel had a clear conscience about history, there was no doubt that she was still happy for Brando's trust at this moment. "No, not all. I don't want to talk about history in terms of success or failure. That's just the superficial view of you mortals. I don't mean to speak without thinking, young man. I just want to show you something." Sabers smiled and replied, The look in his eyes was clearly very interesting. Brendel furrowed his brows. He had actually communicated with Saint Tossel in private, but Saint Tossel's answer was also somewhat curious. No, let him continue, Brando. I think maybe he didn't say anything wrong. Remember, Sabers is not one of those glib-tongued sycophants around that guy. He is a real warrior. Brando nodded. He looked at the King of the Frost Knight. After Sabers put away his sword, the battle between the two sides came to an end. Although this battle made Brando very unhappy, it was purely a suppression of strength. If he could still maintain his strength at his peak, he felt that he might be able to fight the King of the Frost Knight alone. What do you want to show me? He asked. Just a battlefield. Sabers answered faintly. He raised his hand, and the scenery on the extreme plains changed dramatically again. There is an eternal battle in our world. Brando was trying to figure out the meaning of this sentence, but his eyes had already reflected a scene that surprised him. It was an endless field, but there were more than just meadows rolling in the wind like wheat waves. At the end of his vision, there were two huge armies marching. Even Saint Tossel, the Wind Empress, was slightly surprised. Brando might have understood what she was thinking because the army on the horizon was the Black Wing Legion of the Myrna, known as the right wing of the Dark Dragon, the elite of the Myrna. The Black Wing. We defeated this army in the Great Swamp at the cost of many lives, and Eloranta lost an eye forever in this battle. Brando nodded. He even knew the story behind this, and the sacrifice of Orthless. This battle was written into a magnificent poem by poets in later generations to praise the dedication and sacrifice of their ancestors. Then where is this place? Did you have another war with them? Saint Tossel shook her head blankly. Obviously, she was also puzzled by the scene in front of her. Brando looked at the other side of the sky. He was curious who the enemy of these arrogant Myrna was, the equally large army that was like a black cloud. On the side, Sabers still seemed to be immersed in his own memories as he told the story. In this war, I belonged to the 7th column of the Earth Legion, and I was honored to become a commander under Lord Odin. Earth Legion? Isn't it the Black Wing? Brando seemed to have heard the name for the first time, but he felt that it was vaguely familiar. The Frost Knight King glanced at him and did not answer the question. It's different from what you think. This legion has been passed down for much longer than you think. And even we don't know the origin of the system. It seems that this legion has existed before the birth of the Myrna. Some say that it even came from the era of the divine people, from before the destruction of Babel Fortress. But warriors like us are like a brand in our blood, and we are born a part of this legion. This memory seems to be inherited from the soul, and it allows us to understand our position in this huge sequence. Everyone has such a responsibility. Can you imagine? Brando opened his mouth slightly. He did not understand what the other party was saying. An army that was born to be a legion? What's going on? But he suddenly felt that he seemed to have heard such a name in the game. Like I said, this is an eternal battle. It's as if there's no beginning and no end. The Earth Legion also exists eternally, as if it's just to fight against their fated enemy. The Frost Knight King replied faintly. Fated enemy? Brando. Saint Tossel's voice suddenly came. Look over there. It was rare for Brendel to hear the Wind Empress speak to him in such an urgent tone. He frowned and subconsciously turned his head back. But what he saw was a flash of light on the horizon. It was not the light of magic, but some kind of strange refraction. Was it the reflection of the armor? No, it did not seem like it. Brando narrowed his eyes. At that moment he finally saw where the refraction came from. It was the color of crystals. Crystal clusters. No, it should be the army of crystal clusters. Brando could not help but subconsciously hold his breath. Martha above, whether it was here or in the game, he had never seen or imagined so many crystal clusters. What was that? To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 790. The weapons in the hands of the Myrnas and the shining body surface of the crystal clusters were like two shining lines on the horizon, colliding with each other heavily. It was a scene that ordinary people who had never experienced war could not imagine. The earth let out a deafening roar, and the sound of battle was like a tsunami, drowning out the dying cries of the living, and also drowning out fear, hesitation, and all negative emotions. The smoke and dust raised by the war covered the sky, and the dazzling sunlight was also dimmed. The scene in front of them was dazzling and real. However, there was no record of such a war in the history books. There were also no records of such a war under the dust and cobwebs in the white ivory towers of Canada. In the game, the players passed on all kinds of information, but there were still no secrets on the forums of the strange land. The crystal clusters, a species born in the crystal jungle in the player's impression, seemed to be a scattered population isolated from the main historical plot in the game. They existed in the corners of the world where there were few people, and they only appeared occasionally during the journeys of explorers. There was no record of them in history, from the appearance of the divine people to the destruction of Ebabel Fortress, and then to the golden people who started the second era of mortals. The Silver Clans, the rise of the Silver People, the rise of the Silver People, and the rise of the Black Iron Flame on the land, and the erection of the Eagle and the Hydra flag. In this long history, the historians and white-robed wizards only left a few dull and monotonous records of them. They have no wisdom, no consciousness, and are like a kind of crystal derivative, attacking invaders who approach their territory by instinct. The player's knowledge originated from this, and it was not far off. It was as if the crystal clusters were natural soldiers and cannon fodder set up by the system, only adding some mysterious color to this strange world. But who would have thought that there was such a war on the other side of history? On one side of the war were the noble golden people, the Myurnas, the founders of the empire, the ancestors, and the servants of the dark dragon. They were once the enemies of an entire world, but even their hatred could not hide the radiance of their bloodline. The golden blood that flowed within their bodies that the divine people had promised their descendants. The other side was beyond Brando's imagination, or rather, the other half of his soul, Sophie's imagination. It was the crystal cluster, a rarity in her impression. As for the scattered groups, according to the records of the sages, they should have acted like wild beasts, following their instincts. But here, the crystal clusters had formed a well-organized army. They had their own flag, armor and weapons. They were disciplined, and their organization and scale were not inferior to the descendants of the gods that they were facing. Brando realized that he might have seen another civilization, a strange one that he had never heard of, a civilization that had been isolated from history. The civilization of the crystal cluster. Wait, I should have expected this. Brendel suddenly realized that they seemed to have subconsciously overlooked one thing. Since when did these creatures that were born in the crystals appear on the ground? Suddenly looking back, history was blank. However, from the first line of the Pale poem, when this world was created, these tiny life forms had already existed. At this time, he suddenly remembered the words of the dear demon Helene. Master and that person fought against an unfamiliar enemy together. The master was Kelsey. That person was the dark dragon, Odin. And those enemies were the crystal clusters. Then, what were they, and where did they come from? Why did they become enemies with the Myurnas, and where did they go after the War of the Holy Saints? He looked at Sabers, the king of the Frost Night, and the only one who could answer his question. Sabers sighed softly. Do you understand, Saint Tossel? Brando did not understand what this rhetorical question meant at all. Perhaps only the soul of the Wind Empress in his ring could answer. But the Elf Queen, who had always been strong, chose to be unusually silent at this moment. After a moment, her voice finally sounded. Thank you for answering a question that has always been in my heart, but this does not mean anything. You want to say that Odin and his Earth Legion protected this world, but the Gold Legion did not. Sabers, it wasn't us who rose up against you. It was you who chose to walk down this path that was bound to fail. Thousands of years ago. Brando frowned. When he was listening to the conversation between the two, Sabers sighed faintly. I also understand this point. Saint Tossel, the Azure Knight, opened the era of mortals. The stars fell to the earth and formed the earth. After that, the gold folk disappeared, and the silver folk were scattered on the earth, resulting in the rise of the iron folk. You, the Flame King Gretel, built the kingdom single-handedly. I am not saying that they were unintentional. Do you still remember what I said before? It's just that right and wrong is not the main point. Sabers, what are you trying to say? I just want to say that the failure of the Myurnas, the establishment of the Four Kingdoms, my king had already predicted all of this. That's impossible. It's possible, Saint Tossel. You are an elf and I am a human. Even if I am a gold folk, I can still feel the greed and desire that belonged to this body when it was alive. This is the source of civilization. Standing on the meadow, the king of Frost Knight's soul fire flashed brightly and wisely as if it had pierced through the shackles of time. History has repeated for thousands of years, and there has never been an exception. Whether it is the humans or the elves, the dynasties have fallen. But that's all. From the dynasty of the Myrnas to the empire of the Cruz people, and then to the small kingdom where our little friend is located, the rise and fall of the dynasties, when has there ever been an exception? The struggle for power and profit, the conspiracy, nothing more. Saint Tossel, what about the mist elves who once followed you? The Wind Empress was shocked. Even Brando felt the shock in the soul of the elven royal sister. She did not say a word. Then why did Odin make this choice? Was it out of helplessness? Then after the War of the Holy Saints, where did the crystal clusters go? Brando asked the question that he wanted to know the answer to the most at this moment. I don't know. Saber's answer was simple and clear. You don't know? Brando was almost going crazy. Since you don't know, then what's the point of letting all this out? What's the point? This land where the war took place is called Myrnas in our language. Today, it should be east of Fanzin and Saint Tossel that you are familiar with. I followed the former king across the Alkash Mountains to fight against these mysterious enemies. I don't know more about them than you do, but the ancient language inherited in my blood tells me that they already existed before the Myrnas. They are our enemies, and this war lasted for a long time. But in my era, the war between the Myrnas and the crystal clusters only lasted for a short period of time. During the war, there were 5 planeswalkers like you who participated in the war. After that, I returned to the Alfalfa Wilderness with the Blackwing Legion. In order to suppress the increasingly violent resistance in the Empire, that war seemed to have disappeared shortly after that, Sabers said tirelessly. Then why are you here, Sabers? Since this war no longer has anything to do with you, Brando asked with a frown. Because I was ordered to wait here. Wait for someone who understands the true meaning of the fool to come. The Frost Night King stared at Brando and answered word by word. The fool. Brando remembered the talent that he inherited from the Dark Dragon. But what did the fool mean? From Saber's description, was it a savior? Or was it a person with fanatical self-sacrifice? No matter which one it was, Brando felt that he did not have it, nor did he want to be. Other than the heroine in his memory, his relationship with this world might not be as close as he imagined. But the question was, why did the Dark Dragon choose him? Or was it just that he was lucky enough to meet it? This answer was not that tenable. Perhaps for thousands of years, there were not many people who could touch the Dark Dragon's sealing stone. But why didn't Odin choose Amon? Was it because Amon was a priest of the Holy Cathedral of Fire? This reason might not be correct because it could be seen from Saber's description that Odin might not be as prejudiced against the 4 saints and their descendants as ordinary people would imagine. You're saying that I understand the meaning of the fool. But I don't. Brando answered cautiously. He had to admit that he was still worried that if he answered this way, Sabers would choose to take back the Dark Dragon's inheritance. It had to be said that this inheritance was still very meaningful to him. Whether it was the great power itself or the support of the witches behind it, especially the former, it had helped him defeat strong enemies many times. But Shah and her followers were also a potentially powerful force. No one knew better than Brando about the witches' infiltration and understanding of this world. But he had to ask clearly. The scene that Saber showed today was beyond his understanding. It made him realize that there was a huge secret hidden behind this world. The fool talent might be a hidden danger. What if Sabers told him that he had to inherit the responsibility of saving the world by inheriting the talent of the fool? What choice should he make? Brando felt that he did not have that much ability. Saber's eyes that were dancing with soul flame stayed on his face for a moment. You will understand, he replied slowly. What? This answer was beyond Brando's expectations. The Frost Night King was playing a riddle with him. This firm tone reminded him of the wrinkled faces under the gypsy tents. The Myrnas advocated a mysterious culture. In their eyes, fate was unknown and certain. There was no chance, only inevitability. But Brando, Sophie's dual souls, could not accept this answer. If this was a mission, then he should have the right to understand everything and make a choice, not play hide and seek in this language maze. If this was still in the world of The amber sword. He stared at Sabers, showing a look that said he would not give up until he got an answer. However, Sabers seemed to have expected this. The fool does not have a fixed meaning. It represents this kind of behavior. I read your past from your eyes. I think you are the one that the late king was waiting for, young man. My past? Some people are destined to be mediocre. But some people can work hard towards their goals from the beginning to the end. Even if they clumsily repeat ridiculous failures, even if they are not understood by others, they may fail. But once they succeed, it will be called a miracle and spread by everyone. Most of them become the fools in the eyes of ordinary people. Their stupidity is not stubbornness, but they know better than others what they are doing. You mean Odin? I mean you, young man. You know what you want to do. Brando was silent. He did know what he wanted to do. Perhaps in the eyes of most people, Erwin was just repeating the history of a dynasty changing. Decades ago or 100 years ago, it also went through the same history. The Rotten dynasty was mentioned by the new soil. After the fall of the Cipher royal family, the new moon of Corvado rose. But its master was always the indomitable people of Erwin. But it was different this time. Everyone ignored the hidden enemy in the east. The dark nobles who had been undisciplined for thousands of years were now united under the one and only Mercury staff. Perhaps in 40 years history would repeat itself, and the people of Erwin who belonged to Erwin would no longer exist. Perhaps this kingdom was nothing more than a name that represented a certain meaning. However, for Carwins, the silver flag covered many familiar corpses, princesses, Valkyrie, and the memories and beliefs of many people who had fought side by side with him. So he had to be one step ahead. Was he stupid? Perhaps in the eyes of Amandina, the princess, the copper dragon Reto, and all his followers, enemies and bystanders, there was something strange. Just like how Carglai still did not understand why he always had to prepare for everything. He even agreed with Amandina that this lord had a greater ambition in his heart. He wanted to be like the late King Eric. Brando did want to be like that, but his title was not the king of this land, but the sage who led the people out of the thorns and darkness. This is the fool? Brendel muttered to himself. It's not limited to just that. I can't tell you much, but there's a voice in my blood that tells me that you will understand all of this. Young man, whether it's you, me, or the noble soul in your ring, all of us are searching. The world in the eyes of many is an absurd stage, a vanity fair, a gloomy place full of intrigue and intrigue. They bind their eyes in a superficial cage, and this cage is their desire and thoughts. The Frost Night King smiled mysteriously. But we are not like that. You know what I'm saying, because this world is not as simple as it appears to be, right? Brando was horrified. This world was not as simple as it appeared to be. He didn't know if Sabers was referring to something, but at least from his point of view it was indeed so. This was because he knew that this world had another name in its past and present life. It was called the Amber Sword. It was a name that only he knew. The people who knew the meaning of this name were now isolated from him in another world. This secret. Brando hesitated and asked, is it related to those crystal clusters? Maybe, but maybe not. There's a voice in the dark that tells me the truth behind the war. But I know very little. Lord Odin can't tell me much. He sealed his life's knowledge in this inheritance. He didn't force you to choose anything, but history repeats itself, and what should happen will happen. The War of the Holy Saints is not an accident. If I'm not wrong, war is about to come to this world again. Brando did not answer, but he knew that the Frost Night King's guess was right. It's just that history repeats itself. Maybe it's not fate, but the repeated selfishness and greed of the civilization. The upcoming war for the slate was a footnote to this. So in the end, it's still the fault of the civilization itself? Brando frowned and shook his head. He felt like his head was going to explode. These things might not be what he should be worried about. He sighed. Although he did not understand what Saint Tassel, Sabers, and Odin were really pursuing, he at least understood what he was pursuing. Whether it was superficial or noble, he had to do it. He stuck to his stubborn character that he developed in the game. He looked up and decided not to play games with the Frost Night King. In his opinion, this might be the Frost Night King's own bad taste. The Myrnas worshipped mystery, and they always played with their agnosticism carefully and delicately. However, Brando had his own way of doing things. He opened his mouth and interrupted Saber's long speech. You mean only when I understand all of this, I am qualified to inherit the Dark Dragon's inheritance? No. Saber shook his head. In fact, the strength you showed at the beginning has already qualified you to inherit the inheritance. I just want to tell you everything that happened behind the scenes of this war. Whether it's the Cruise people or the Wind Elves, it's still far from the time when you can sit back and relax. Brando quietly stared at the Frost Night King. The hidden meaning in his eyes was, if that's the case, what's the point of all the nonsense you said before? If he was alive, perhaps he would feel a little embarrassed facing Brando's questioning gaze. However, Saber's was an undead. Thousands of years of icy wind had already frozen his withered skeleton-like cheeks. Therefore, the Frost Night King's expression did not change. Because this is the mission I've been waiting for here. What does that have to do with me? It's impossible for me to follow the path of the Dark Dragon. In my opinion, what I've inherited is merely his legacy and not his will. I hope you can understand this. Brendel hesitated for a moment before deciding to tell the truth. I'll never follow the path of the Dark Dragon. In my opinion, I've only inherited his legacy and not his will. When Brando said this, he felt a little praise in his heart. Sir Saint Tossel? He could not help but feel a little puzzled. But the Wind Empress did not respond. Aren't you afraid that I'll take back your inheritance, young man? Saber's tone was cold. I'm afraid that's not something you can decide, respected Frost Night King. Although I don't know why Odin chose me, this is my will. Brando's tone became firm. If he still did not understand the meaning of this guy after such a long time of probing, then he could really kill himself. Whether you accept it or not, it's the same. I'm Brando, not the Dark Dragon. You're just as stubborn. The Frost Night King was slightly stunned, then chuckled. It was filled with the laughter of the undead's hollow voice. To be continued. If you like this work, you're welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 791. What are you laughing at? Brando was puzzled by the other party's attitude. The Frost Night King's eyes burned brighter, and a subtle smile appeared on his pale face. You can rest assured that I did not intend to take back the inheritance of the Dark Dragon, because you have passed the test perfectly. Passed perfectly? Although the strength you showed in the previous battle was terrible, at least your judgment is extraordinary. This shows that you have a fighting mind, and the mind is more important than anything else. Not to mention, you also have the potential to become a planeswalker. Although you're only an apprentice, I can see that you've already found your own path. Becoming a powerhouse is only a matter of time for you. As for my question, you have answered it. Young man, you have made a mistake. What Odin is looking for is not the Dark Dragon, but someone who can bear this responsibility. And my duty is to show you the future of Wond. Vaunt's future is what you call a never-ending war? Are you trying to say that the crystal clusters are the hidden enemies of our world, and they may have even served the Twilight Dragon? I don't know. This is Odin's intention. But at least I know that the growth of our world's civilization is not smooth sailing. The evil cultists, the Black Forest, and the monsters are everywhere invading the borders of the civilized world. This war has never ended. I know this even if you don't say it. No one will wait for death. The enemies of this world are not only the crystal clusters. Even without the crystal clusters, we still have to go through the magic tide. The 12 moons have never shone on Wond with good intentions. We still have the calamity of wolves and the evil cultists to deal with. Saber smiled and did not explain further. Since you have thought it through, please accept the gift from the ancient bloodline. He pointed at his pale chest that was covered in patterns. Under his festering skin, a heart that was burning with raging flames was beating. The second inheritance of the Dark Dragon. The precious knowledge from the Crystal Dragon, Scorch, is right here. Raise your sword and stab me. This. Brando looked at him and was stunned. Why are you in a daze? I'm not going to wait for death. Sabers raised the frost blade in his hand. The treasure is with me. If you want to use it, use your sword to take it. F***CK. The ice cave was rather quiet. Someone had already finished telling the story of what had happened earlier. In his hand, the bright blade of Frost Chant Sinna was placed horizontally. reflecting the ice that had accumulated over tens of thousands of years on top of the cave, forming a cold pond. Brendel stared at his left hand. From an outsider's point of view, it was covered with a layer of dragon scales, the blessing of the dragon god. But under the armor, the skin on the back of his hand was scorched, and the ugly charred wounds were spread out in a radial pattern. In the center of these twisted wounds, there was a black gem that glowed, and within the gem was a flame as bright as amber. That was the Dark Dragon's second legacy, the Ash Sword Saint. Alaz did not speak for a long time, as if she was still thinking about the war described by sabers. Everyone was thinking about why the Myrna Lord appeared here, and only pulled Count Tonagel into the extreme plains. Brando certainly did not mention the Dark Dragon's inheritance, but the future that sabers showed him was enough to attract the attention of others. A person's voice sounded. How can you be sure that what he showed you is real? The one who spoke was Prince Lenoret Aurelius. The expression on the prince's face was indifferent to trust or distrust. It only made people believe that he only spoke out of an instinctive desire to control the topic. He never wanted us to believe that it was real, Your Highness. He just showed it to us. As for whether we believe it or not, it doesn't hurt him at all. After all, that's sabers. I've heard legends about this person from my father since I was very young. The King of the Frost Night. Such a character really doesn't need to play tricks with us. Not to mention that he was already dead long before the end of the War of the Holy Saints. Veronica denied Lenoret's question. Even the Prince of Cruz did not dare to question his mentor's judgment. The female Legion commander looked calm and put away her longsword. When her voice echoed in the cold and sealed underground, she looked at Brando, who was sitting on a rock covered with ice and snow, and joked, "Don't you feel cold?" It was not that Brando did not feel cold, but he was tired to death. "Madam Legion Commander, I don't have the energy to joke." He rolled his eyes. "It's definitely tiring to fight with such an existence, Mr. Brando." Shido hurriedly comforted him. "Yes, it's indeed something to be proud of for not being defeated. But I want to hear your opinion, Brando. Why did sabers pull you into the extreme plains? I don't think he just wants to show you a picture of war. Or rather, why did he do it? This question is too difficult. Can you change it?" "I'm afraid not." Brando wanted to brush it off, but the lady's gaze made him understand. He was afraid that he had to find a reasonable reason today, or he would not be able to convince her. The commander of Azure Skies had already proven her shrewdness back in the loop of trade winds. She wasn't asking her this question because she had lost her ability to discern the situation. "Okay. I think he wants to warn us." "Warn us? What is the greatest enemy of civilization?" "It's the cultists, the dark forest, the monsters, the world beyond the fog. All the creatures who believe in Martha are fighting a long war with the monsters. This war has not started, and no one knows when it will end. This story seems to be written like this, but has anyone ever thought about why it is like this? That's something that the scholars have to explore. Our scholars have unearthed many ancient tablets and documents. One day we will figure out how to end this war and stop the dusk from eroding civilization. Our scholars are still studying the documents of the Myrnas, but the Myrnas themselves must know more than we do, don't they? After the Dusk Dragon was defeated by the Knight of the Azure Skies, they know better than us what happened to the world." Brando asked. Veronica could only nod in silence. "But why did he want to warn us? History tells us that they are our enemies. We were the ones who defeated the Dark Dragon and ended the rule of the Myrnas." Veronica was puzzled. Perhaps this is the reason why sabers rushed here. When the War of the Holy Saints was at its most crucial moment, he left the Dark Dragon. If this is not the most serious betrayal, then there must be something else. This secret seemed to be to preserve the legacy of the Dark Dragon. But that was not what Brando wanted to say. Otherwise, even his teacher Mephisto would personally kidnap him and bring him back to Cruz's Golden Flame Temple to receive the highest standard of interrogation in front of the Flame King Gretel's holy elephant. Be it humans or elves, although they were at war with each other, no one had forgotten the War of the Holy Saints that ended 7 centuries ago. The terror of the Dark Dragon was like a dark cloud that shrouded history for 1,000 years. Perhaps the Saint Tossel could forgive it, but that did not mean that everyone could. Otherwise, why would the Wind Elves and Fanzin people monitor the border of the Great Glacier day after day? Fortunately, Brando already had an idea in his mind. In terms of history of fighting against monsters, the Myrnas have a longer history than us. The Dusk Dragon was killed by the Knight of the Azure Skies, so they must know many secrets that we do not know. Don't forget, this is Milo's breath, the final resting place of the Frost Giant King. In the legends, he fought with the wolves and finally died here. But is there only the remains of the giant's father here? I'm afraid not. The skeletons we saw earlier and the mercury-like enemy can already explain many things. You're saying that sabers left Odin at the most critical time of the War of the Holy Saints. It is likely to be related to the war between civilization and the Dusk. The tyrant had a premonition that his death was imminent, so he sent his capable men to arrange his funeral? Brando raised his head and found that the one who said this was Prince Leneret Aurelius. He could not help but feel overjoyed. The credibility of his words was much higher than his own. He thought that he would have to guide Miss Scholar to judge for herself, but he did not expect the eldest son of Cruz to be much sharper than he thought. This was simply an unexpected surprise. If the other party was not a prince but a princess of the Empire, he would have hugged the other party and kissed her fiercely. The Dark Dragon, is he so kind? The Ash Sword Saint replied faintly. This is possible, Sir Sword Saint. Academia has long inferred that Odin may have predicted his own demise. In fact, the escape of the Myrnas and witches began long before the fall of the Empire. The Myrnas and witches are loyal to the Dark Dragon. If not for this, they would never abandon the tyrant. This is actually not unreasonable. The tyrannical rule of the Myrnas has already sowed the root of the Empire's destruction. The justice of history cannot be resisted. With Odin's wisdom, I'm afraid he has already seen through their inevitable end. Shido explained softly. Odin is the Dark Dragon, but he also believes in Martha. Monsters and cultists are not only our enemies. Prince Leneret was obviously very dissatisfied with Mephisto's questioning of him. Then what kind of secret is hidden here? Veronica frowned. I think this is what Sabers wants to warn us. I suspect that there may be something sealed here. Otherwise, Erek would have rushed here. They have already gotten the heart of the dragon. They don't need to play hide and seek with us here. After Brando finished this sentence, his face suddenly changed and he stood up straight. He just wanted to find a plausible excuse, but now he suddenly felt that it might not be impossible for it to be the truth. As he said, why did Erek and the others want to enter Milo's breath so badly? They were not a group of ordinary people. They were cultists, the enemies that Sabers mentioned. Moreover, the inheritance of the Dark Dragon could be placed anywhere. It did not have to come to this desolate place. The more Brando thought about it, the more he felt that it was possible. His mind was once again filled with his strange dream. Why did the Myrnas guard this place day after day? Oh no! Didn't we always feel that something is watching us from behind? He turned around and said to everyone with a serious face, what is it? Alaz squinted her golden eyes and finally spoke. She was not interested in sabers, but she was very curious about this matter. But Brando did not answer her directly. Instead he said, I think I know what Erek and the others want to do. Brando, have you guessed something? Veronica asked. Brando nodded. You guys are good. If I'm not wrong, All for One is about to awaken that thing. That thing? Yes, that thing. The hidden boss that was said to have never appeared in the Frost Forest. The awakening god, Sir Ash. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 792. The streets were filled with fog. A young girl from a candle shop walked slowly with a bundle of lamb oil candles in her arms. The White Rose Avenue of the City of Ashes was reviving with the first glimmer of dawn. The owner of the Imperial City's grocery store, Ma Paley, opened the door and greeted the young girl. Seti, you're early. Good morning, Mr. Ma Paley. Seti replied with a smile. The palace is rushing me, so of course I'm early. I saw you working late last night. Isn't this too tiring? Yes, it's because my father's legs aren't very nimble. As his daughter, this is what I should do. Old Chris is really lucky to have such a good daughter. The owner of the grocery store complained indignantly. Unlike that bastard of mine. The young girl held the candle and smiled. Just as she was about to reply, The sound of horses galloping could be heard from the street leading to the sacred silver palace. Everyone instinctively shut their mouths and the pedestrians on the street retreated to both sides. Seti stood in the crowd with the candle in her hand and frowned as she looked towards the south. The fog started to roll. A pitch-black carriage appeared at the end of his field of vision like a ghost. Dozens of knights wearing gray cloaks galloped past like a whirlwind, opening a path for the carriage. The war horses that the knights sat on were pitch-black like ink, and the armor on their bodies was like a ball of flame. They were the Grey Knights of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. As the carriage slowly passed by, the people began to talk again. "It's the Kirk family." Ma Pei looked in the direction where the carriage disappeared and turned back. "Seti, I heard that the nobles lost the war in the south. Your brother." "My brother will be fine." The rose garden of the St. Cantifer Palace was open, and the pure white road led to the shade of the royal garden. In St. Cantifer's palace, the black marble floor was like a carpet. Roses made of silver extended outwards along the dark ground. The supreme ruler of the empire sat on the cold, narrow stone throne with a long back. He turned his head slightly and listened to the monks of the Holy Cathedral of Fire ring the golden bell 7 times. The famous maxim was engraved 3 inches above her head: "There must be thorns under the rose." The Silver Queen of the Cruise people was also their supreme empress. Constance had a baby face, and for some special reason, her body maintained its original appearance when she was young. Her long blonde hair almost reached her waist, making her look like a delicate doll. But in fact, this teenage queen was already a mother of 7 children, and also a typical Cruise person. In the eyes of other races, a typical Cruise was arrogant, condescending, and imperial. In the political landscape of the empire, this represented toughness and an iron fist. This was especially evident in the queen. The queen looked straight ahead, and in her field of vision was the scenery she saw every day. The Golden Palace had no gates, so the power of the empress was not limited. Everywhere she looked, it was the territory of the empire, and also the backyard of the empire's conquerors. But there, the clouds in the sky to the north of the palace were low and rolling, as if a rare storm was brewing. This storm had never been experienced in Wone for 1,000 years, and no one had seen it before. So, at this moment, no one knew what kind of magnificent era it would usher in for this world. Looking straight ahead, the Silver Queen's gaze never fell on her courtiers. However, she suddenly waved her hand in annoyance, interrupting the courtiers below. "I don't want to hear you talk about what happened in the south. House of Ashric, your eldest daughter offended the Druids in the loop of trade winds. I can forgive that. House Rupert, William suffered a loss at the hands of Aween, but he is already dead. The dead have no sins. I only want to know 2 things. First, who gave Williams the authority to mobilize the border fleet? Second, who is the new Count Tonagel who defeated our Erwin? Does he know how to use heaven's armament? What is his relationship with the arrogant knight in the north?" As soon as Constance finished speaking, an old man covered in sweat crawled out from the direction of the Williams family. "Your Majesty, please be merciful and give us this opportunity. We will definitely find that person. He is not only an enemy of the Empire but also of our family." Constance only glanced at Duke Cecil for a moment. She looked up. "Erwin is no longer important to the Empire today. I only want them to agree to participate in the Holy War in the name of the Holy Cathedral. Since the mages of Buga want to interfere, let them take it. As long as it doesn't fall into the hands of the elves of St. Tossel. But Your Majesty, Erwin has always been within the traditional sphere of influence of the Holy Cathedral of Fire." A voice was heard. The Queen looked over and found that the one who interrupted her was Archbishop Quake. Her expression didn't change. Instead, she asked softly, "Archbishop Quake, are you talking to me about religious affairs or government affairs?" Quake's expression changed, and he immediately shut his mouth. "I am very concerned about the rumor that the Azure Lance was discovered in Erwin. I will leave this matter to you." Constance stood up from her throne. She was short, but no one dared to underestimate her. For a moment, no one in St. Cantipe Palace dared to breathe. The Queen looked around and then left with the escort of her servants. In a corner of St. Cantipe Palace, House Kirk and House Ashric were almost gathered together. Duke Helix and Count Rodney watched the Queen leave. The latter could not help but smack his lips. Before you come into contact with Her Majesty, it is hard to imagine that such a woman has controlled the empire for 40 years. I am ashamed to say that when I was young, I used to fantasize about her. Her Majesty's appearance was fixed at a young age because of a special experience. Seriously speaking, when I was your age, Her Majesty was already like this. Duke Helix's hair was white and his eyebrows were straight into his temples. His face was full of hardships, but he did not put on airs when talking to Count Rodney, who was a generation younger than him. Everyone knew that House Kirk and House Ashrick were very close. House Ashrick's current matriarch, Veronica, was even the swordsmanship teacher of Duke Helix's 2 granddaughters. Her Majesty's health is not as good as it used to be. Otherwise, she would not have agreed to let the princes of this generation go out for training. Count Rodney nodded. At the same time, he looked at Duke Cecil, who was ignored by the Silver Queen, with a little pity. He said gloatingly, "House Cecil is going to be unlucky this time. Williams has really left them a big problem." "Don't be happy too early." The Duke shook his head disapprovingly. At his age, he had seen too many ups and downs. "Don't think that old man Cecil is trembling in front of Her Majesty. He still has some strength left to deal with you and me. Deal with us." Rodney was puzzled. Why would he want to deal with us? We didn't provoke him. Is he crazy? You'll have to ask your sister about this. Her Majesty and we both know what she did in the loop of trade winds. You should advise her not to get too close to those Erewhon people. Judging from Her Majesty's tone, she might not be satisfied with what she did. Duke Helix replied. Sigh. Count Rodney sighed, obviously thinking of Veronica. How can I persuade her? She has her own ideas. But I think that since Her Majesty made her the teacher of the eldest prince, she won't be too heartless. The Duke patted the young man's shoulder. That's why our situation might not be better than Cecil's. We can only blame our bad luck for getting involved with Erewhon at this time. A few days ago, when Veronica sent the Prime Minister's precious daughter back, she offended one of the most powerful people in the capital. On top of that, during the trip to the loop of trade winds last time, those parents whose children died might not be satisfied with us. If it's that serious, then what should we do now? Rodney suddenly felt a chill run down his spine. Find someone. Find someone. Duke Helix nodded. Don't worry about other people's attitudes. What we need to do is to change Her Majesty's plans for us. Her Majesty's intentions are clear. She doesn't care about Erewhon's position. She only wants the Azure Lance. Wait, the Azure Lance? You mean that Count Tonagel? The Moon of Scrolls 22nd clear. Thanks to the efforts of the guide, our carriage passed through the White Rose Castle Pass as scheduled. It is said that only on the side of the Sea of the Dying Moon near the Erech Mountains can we see the marvelous sight of a carriage and a sailboat on the sea. Unfortunately, the heavens did not let us have our wish. Because it is the season after summer, due to the wind and ocean currents, there are very few ships near the Sea of Dirtle. This afternoon, we finally bid farewell to the suffering of several days of trekking, and arrived in the territory of Lantanaland. Luther recorded in Odape. Brando obviously did not expect that there would be people talking about him thousands of miles away. All he had to do now was to answer Veronica's question. The Awakening God? The Awakening God, Sir Ash, had always been a legend in the Amber Sword. In the game there were a total of 8 bosses in the group dungeon in the heart of the deadly Frost Forest. Ekis' youngest daughter, the Dimko Hua, the twin calamities of the Duskwolves, Main and Mare, the Frostworm that occupied the Roa Hall, the chief wizard of the Black Flame Disciples, the illusionist Eric, the autonomous defensive weapon of Milo's heart, the Frost Core, the leader of the Black Flame Disciples, the head of the Black Flames Roderick, and the one who was still with them, the door god, the Frost Dragon Sheeta. However, in fact, there had been a rumor among the players that there should still be a hidden boss in this temple. The Awakening God, Sir Ash. This rumor began with a series of quest chains in the northern Fanzon. In the headquarters of the faraway Eagle Knight in White City, there was a diary that could trigger a quest. The owner of the diary was the former leader of the faraway Eagle. This identity itself was not special, but the contents of the diary were very strange. Brando later went to the Knight's Kingdom, Grecius, in his previous life, and did this quest on the way, so the contents of the diary were still fresh in his memory. The diary recorded the story of the leader when he was young. At that time, he was just an ordinary mercenary and had no contact with the famous mercenary group, the Eagle of Faraway Nights. In the diary, he wrote about his adventurous travels with an archaeological team to various parts of the world. The owner of the diary was very proud of these experiences because it was indeed rare for ordinary people to see and hear. However, there were also some things that the owner of the diary couldn't understand. One of the most famous was the mystery of Odape. The diary wrote that in the summer of 312, which was the year of thunder, more than half a century ago. At that time, Erwin's Anson XI had just ascended the throne and issued a militia training decree. The era of Erwin's prosperity had just begun. The owner of the diary followed his archaeological group to a small kingdom located at the border of Cruz. They crossed the plateau between Erwin and Cruz and inspected the ruins left behind by the Myernas. After that, they went all the way south, past Ampere Seal, and arrived at a fishing village in Odape. There, the owner of the diary described something interesting that they saw. They found that the local residents were all worshipping a god with a specific image. This is really an interesting thing. The locals described the god as having a face like thunder, eyes like fire, and skin that shone like silver. Every night, it would come from the south, riding on a flame, and after patrolling the sky once, it would return to the south. But as far as I know, ever since the night of Azure pierced the sky and caused the stars to fall to the ground, the dispute between the gods subsided. After that, the gods and the divine people left Wone together. Although the laws they left behind still protect our world, the specific god no longer exists on this land. The diary described it as such. But surprisingly, in the following days, the owner of the diary and his group also witnessed the descent of the god with their own eyes. A red pillar of fire rose from the south, and the flames seemed to burn the night sky in that direction. The whole night sky was fiery red. Then I witnessed the miracle with my own eyes. There seemed to be a path in the sky that did not exist, and a specific god walked along it. After circling the sky, it returned to the pillar of fire. In order to prove that I did not fabricate facts out of thin air, I recorded the appearance of the god I saw here. His skin seemed to be made of shiny metal, and his whole body was flowing with silver light and surrounded by lightning. His eyes were gushing with golden flames. Then, the archaeological group set off to the south to investigate this matter. Unfortunately, when they passed by Twin Woods town between Beta Vernon and Golden Woods Forest, they were attacked by a dragon. The dragon did not kill them, but took away all their supplies. They had no choice but to cancel the temporary trip. After returning to White City, the owner of the diary had been brooding over this matter, but unfortunately, this trip was his last long-distance trip. Not long after that, he had no choice but to join the faraway Eagles. Although his excellent knowledge and talent allowed him to quickly rise to the top of the mercenary knight order and rise to the center of power, what he saw in the fishing village of Odapi had always been a question in his heart. This question lingered until the death of the owner of the diary, but it did not disappear into the dust until the players found this diary. The fishing village of Odapi was expanded into Violet Castle by Count Odapi in the year of the Water Harp, and became the center of the Odapi region. Today, the south of Violet Castle was the Deadly Frost Forest. According to historical records, after the year of the forest shadow, the local residents no longer saw the strange phenomenon in the night sky. Although this incident once alarmed the Haviland Church of Anthony, an autonomous sect of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, the adventurer group organized by the church was never able to take action. After about a year and a half, the frequency of the strange phenomenon gradually decreased, and the matter was left unsettled. Because of this, there were very few written records of this short-lived god, which brought great difficulty to the players' later investigation. Even when the players' strength had grown to the point where they could enter the Deadly Frost Forest alone, they still could not solve this mystery. The question in the heart of the faraway Eagles leader had since become the most mysterious legend among the players. So, if Erek is really looking for that thing, then it's easy. If the Frost Knight Kingsabers really wants to remind us of this, it might save us a lot of time. Brendel explained the contents of the diary to Veronica and the others. If the Frost Knight Kingsabers wants to remind us of this, it might save us a lot of time. What do you mean, Count? Before Veronica could speak, Shido, who was standing beside her, could not hold back her curiosity and asked, "Is there any important information recorded in the diary?" "That's not it." Brando thought that if that was the case, this mystery would not have become one of the biggest questions in the minds of the players later on. But the problem was now they had an unexpected reward. In fact, Brando and Veronica's eyes fell on Sheeta. And before they could, the one who spoke first was the little female dragon, Alaz. "Tell me what's going on." Alaz stared at her own kind with her golden eyes, showing her snow-white little fangs as a threat. "Don't tell me you didn't hear what that guy said just now, or I'll twist your ears off." "No." The little fat dragon covered his ears pitifully and screamed, "I don't know, I've been here for a long time, but I've been sleeping for a long time, you know that too, Allah's sister." "Is that so? So you stole someone's convoy while you were sleepwalking?" The little female dragon snorted coldly and suddenly pounced on Shito's ears, making the latter scream like a pig being slaughtered. She said fiercely, "Don't try to lie to me, tell me the truth." "Wah wah wah, gentler sister. I'll talk. Shita screamed. Chapter 793. "Don't hit me, I remember now, there seems to be such a thing." Shita hurriedly grabbed his head with his short baby fat hands and screamed, "I'll tell you, I did steal their things, but those guys are a bunch of paupers, they don't have anything good to eat at all." The little female dragon grabbed the back of his neck in annoyance and pulled him back, interrupting, "Who asked you this? Tell us, where is that sir?" "Oh no, I really don't know that guy you're talking about." Little fat dragon staggered from the pull and kept shrinking his neck. He shouted in frustration, "Really, I promise, I swear on the third scale of Lord Bahamut. The dragon god doesn't want a disgrace like you. Let's see if you still dare to play tricks." "Alaz, that's enough." Brando had to stop this farce. "You let go of Sheeta, I have a question to ask him." The little female dragon replied bluntly, "Why should I listen to you?" Although she said that, she still let go of Sheeta. The poor latter was dizzy from being shaken by her, and it took a while for him to recover. Sheeta took a deep breath, and finally understood that his future employer seemed to have some weight in front of Alaz, the female dragon. A kind of slippery nature bred in him immediately wanted to hide behind Brando, but just as he was about to move his short legs, Alaz glanced at him with her golden eyes and froze him there in fear. Brando pretended not to see this guy's little move. "Sheeta, you said you don't know Surash? Then the existence that made a contract with you, who is that?" "No, that's not the same thing at all. The one that made a contract with me, but..." The frost dragon suddenly stopped. "But?" Alaz revealed her white and dangerous fangs. No. Sheeta hurriedly waved his short fat hands. "I mean, actually, that thing you're talking about, it's not that I don't know." "Then why are you still keeping us in suspense?" The grumpy little female dragon lifted her little leather boots and kicked him. "Wow!" Sheeta dodged with an agility that did not match his size. He screamed, "I'm not trying to keep you in suspense. It's just that I'm not sure." "Sheeta, speak your mind." Looking at Alaz and Sheeta playing around in front of her, Veronica frowned and had to take the initiative to speak up. These two dragons' concept of time made her a little annoyed. She did not know if this was a side effect of their long lifespan, or the dragons themselves were dismissive of these insignificant dangers. Because the log said that there was a red pillar of fire. I saw it too. I remember that it was around the time of the Year of Thunder. Whenever night fell, a pillar of fire would appear and rush into the sky, forming a golden vortex above the clouds. How long did it last? Brando continued to ask. "Half a year." This scene continued for half a year before it gradually stopped. Little Fatty Dragon replied quickly, "But I really don't know what that is. Such a risky thing, I don't want to go near it. This is surprisingly in line with your cowardly style. Come on, eat my claw." Alaz commented sarcastically. "This is not cowardice, this is wisdom. A gentleman does not stand under a dangerous wall." "Wah!" Before Little Fatty Dragon could finish his sentence, he was almost scratched in the face by Alaz's sharp nails. Veronica looked back. Behind her, after experiencing the encounter with sabers, the arrogant cruise people seemed to have finally learned to restrain themselves. The noble officers had become unusually careful and cautious at the moment. Their faces were more or less pale, perhaps due to the cold, or perhaps due to fear. But the female legion commander really paid attention to Brando. Little guy, how is it? Lady Veronica, I'm not as wise as the Aeneas Friar Perseus. Brando seemed a little helpless about the female legion commander's blind trust. The memory of his previous life was not always applicable in this sparse information of the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator. Even he could only speculate with his experience. But he thought about it and replied, "But I have some ideas. Look." Veronica looked at him with her emerald green eyes and playfully raised her curved eyebrows at him. Unfortunately, the female legion commander's subtle action, which was extremely inconsistent with her age and identity, was only noticed by Brando alone. The Year of Thunder lasted for about half a year, which was surprisingly consistent with the time described in the log. Brando pondered for a moment. Although there were some differences in the description, he was at least 80% sure that what Sheeta described was the same thing that the faraway Eagle commander saw when he was young. He ended his thoughts and looked up. "Sheeta, let me ask you, do you still remember the direction in which the pillar of fire rose at that time?" Sheeta was dodging Allah's attack, so he replied noisily, "It's from the northeast. I still remember the flame I saw that night. It appeared in the northeast night sky. My dear Lord, call Allah's away, she's going to bite me." "Ah, the night sky in the northeast?" Brando turned a deaf ear to the little fat dragon's cry for help. He subconsciously looked in that direction, and in his field of vision were layers of ice and deep darkness, but the next moment he seemed to remember the place. "It's actually there." "You have an idea?" Veronica observed the subtle changes in the young lord's expression. Brando shook his head. He did not expect it to be in that place. The place Sheeta described was far away from the core area of the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator. There was spiral black ice there, so it was called the Spiral Hall. But the Spiral Hall was only a side hall of the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator. There was nothing there, only some icy breath blocking the way. The breath of ice was a kind of magic that was awakened and animated by dark magic from the ancient battlefield. It was one of the many monsters in the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator. Brendel remembered that the drop list of this monster was quite good, so many players came here to farm it. It was the periphery of the temple, and there was no need to enter the time quasi-seal in the center of the dungeon. The difficulty of the monsters was moderate, and there was no threshold. At least thousands of players had explored this area, so there was no reason why there were secrets that had not been discovered by the players. Could there really be some oversight? Brando could not help but be confused. "What's going on, little guy? What are you embarrassed about?" Veronica asked. "Well," Brando also came back to his senses, "there's good news and bad news." "What's the good news and the bad news, can you tell us, Count?" Miss Scholar was always full of curiosity about such riddles and could not help but interrupt. "The bad news is that Erek is likely to not have to pass through the time quasi-seal in the center of the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator at all. My previous predictions were wrong. He may even bypass the maze and go straight to his destination." Shido looked a little worried. "Then what's the good news?" "The good news is that I happen to know where that place is, and I even know a shortcut that can save us a lot of time," Brando said with some hesitation. "In that case, what are you still hesitating about?" Veronica looked at him puzzled. "What I'm hesitating about is that all of this is based on my own judgment. If my judgment is wrong, then we may not have time to make up for this mistake." Brando took a breath. "You're worried about this?" Veronica looked at him incredulously. "What do you mean I'm worried about this? Isn't this a problem worth worrying about?" Brando looked at the others with some puzzlement, because almost everyone looked at him as if they had heard some funny joke. "Count Tonagel, along the way, I haven't seen you make a mistake in judgment. I don't understand why you're questioning yourself when things have come to a head. But I'd rather believe in my own eyes and believe in what I've always seen. I believe you must have your own reasons for this judgment, Count." Shido could not help but answer loudly. Miss Scholar stared at him very seriously. Brando was speechless. His previous judgment was correct because he still had the memory of his previous life. But the deeper he went into the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator, the less information there was on the forum. After that, he had to rely on his own judgment. But he was very clear about the limits of his ability. In the past, the level 130 warrior player in the Amber Sword was not even a first-tier player in the game, let alone the top. His personal combat power was very outstanding, but it was limited to the upper echelons. Some of the characteristics of the top professional players: excellent judgment, and the decision-making power to lead a team or even a guild, as well as the crazy flash of inspiration. He did not have them. And what was this place? This was the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator, a team dungeon that represented the peak of an era in the game. Such a team dungeon, even the first-tier players did not dare to set foot in it. Anyone who could conquer it was the top in this field. Those were the IDs whose names were engraved on the wall of brilliance of the Amber Sword. Brando could still remember those names. If he thought that one day his name could be on par with them, it would undoubtedly be too arrogant. He had such perseverance and willfulness, but some things depended on talent. If Sheeta had told him that the place Erek was going to was Frost Square, or even the core hall of Sehes, he would have led the team there without hesitation, because these two places were also recognized as the most likely places to hide the awakening god. Or take a step back, the Ring Serpent Hall, the control desk, was also acceptable. But it was the Spiral Hall, a place that had been trampled by thousands of people, and there was nothing worth mentioning except for the breath of ice. But the question now was, should he choose to believe his first instinct or more rational judgment? For the first time since coming to this world, Brando began to feel a little headache. He couldn't help but look at the others, but everyone was looking at him, waiting for him to make a decision. Including Cruz's people, almost everyone had unknowingly gotten used to the feeling of being ordered by this lord. As long as someone could lead them to victory, who cared if they were Cruz's people or Erwin's people? Only one voice echoed in the ice cave. With all due respect, Count Tonagel, although I don't understand what you are hesitating about, I want to ask, other than that, do you have a second judgment for us to choose? The one who spoke was the eldest prince of Cruz's people. He glanced at Brando and asked so coldly. Brando was slightly startled. Lenoret is right, Brando. If there is no better choice, then we can only choose a relatively good judgment. Veronica also said, besides, I don't know why you are suddenly confused. You have never been wrong in your judgment, and I believe this time is no exception. After that, she added, you're not going to trick me, are you, little guy? Brando couldn't help but smile bitterly. It wasn't certain who would trick who. If Erek really detonated the thing in his hand, whether it was the awakening god or the twilight seed, he was afraid that they would all be turned to dust. At that time they would naturally be annihilated as well. However, Cruz had lost the first-in-line heir they had painstakingly cultivated, and he was afraid that they would not let it go so easily. Besides, if Haruz died here, Princess Griffine would hate him to death. There was also the little Roman. Brando thought of the little cloth merchant and couldn't help but smile. I hope so. He finally nodded. I can only promise to do my best. He raised his head and ordered Medisha not far away. Medisha, check the condition of the siblings. We'll take them and get ready to go. The Silver Fairy Princess smiled and nodded. Yes, my lord. Brando turned his head, somewhat distracted. Even though the Spiral Hall was a side hall, it was still considered within the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator. Even if they took a shortcut, it was inevitable that they would encounter a battle. This had already deviated from his original plan. He originally thought that Erek would be blocked in the Hall of the Hibernator. This time the only boss he intended to challenge was Sheeta, who was already on their side. But the current situation was obviously far beyond his expectations. Was he really going to take such a group of people to challenge the central dungeon of the Deadly Frost Forest? Brando couldn't help but look at the others. In the distance, the Cruz nobles were whispering. It seemed that they were not preparing to better carry out his orders. Seeing such a scene, he couldn't help but sigh, and his heart was even more uncertain. P.S. Okay, I finally found the feeling. I'm going to die. By the way, I'll recommend a book to everyone. The author of the book is an idiot, but the book is not bad. The key is that the updates are quite fast. The author will be on the list tomorrow. I'll also help count the votes and opinions. Speaking of which, when I saw the speed of others' updates, I suddenly felt a burst of shame. I was spurred on. The title of the book is Disaster Descends. The book number is 2959961. The portal is as follows. http://www.chidian.com book 2959961. SPX I don't know if it can be used. Chapter 794. Just as Brando was heading towards the Spiral Hall, A group of exhausted knights were passing through the shimmering ice forest. The forest was silent in the world wrapped in silver. Every branch that grew from the snow-white trunks was as fragile as glass. With a light touch, it would completely turn into powder with a crack. Heavy footsteps came from afar, and the varying depth of the footsteps showed that the owner was nervous. Then came the rustling sound of insects crawling under the grass, but it was actually the soft footsteps of some kind of four-legged beast. Damn it! The young knights of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment gritted their teeth and cursed as they turned around and pulled out their long swords. The next moment, demons with white fur emerged from the darkness. They were snow-white wolves, all white except for a pair of cold eyes that flashed with a yellow light. The wolves passed through the thorny forest, growling as they attacked the knights from all directions from the bushes, under the snow. At that moment time seemed to stand still. On one hand there were the growling winter wolves and on the other hand there were the roaring knights. 15. 7 over here. The winter wolf's pouncing movement froze in the cold air, and then a narrow and bright blade pierced its throat. The white beast rolled over and fell to the side of the bushes. The knights took a step back in unison, leaving a long row of corpses quietly flowing with dirty black blood. Black smoke rose from the bodies of the monsters and disappeared in the blink of an eye. The wolves were like a rolling wall of snow as they passed over the corpses of their own kind. They growled and stood side by side, their silver fur moving without wind. Accompanied by the low growls of these demons, the dark magic in the forest was gathering at a speed visible to the naked eye. The magic formed intertwined blue curves, and then condensed into crystal ice prisms. The ice prisms were suspended in the air for a moment, and the next moment they came like a storm. On. With a hoarse roar, one halo after another unfolded from the knights of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment. The knights waved their long swords and smashed the icicles into pieces. A few icicles passed through the gaps between the blades and hit the halo on the armor, shattering into pieces and exploding into a cloud of ice mist. Brund frowned and punched the winter wolf's open bloody mouth, almost knocking it back with a punch, splashing blood and broken teeth. Then, he turned around and slashed at the face of another winter wolf that was waiting for an opportunity to pounce on him, leaving a wound that was so deep that the bone could be seen. The beast whimpered and fled with its bleeding wound, disappearing into the darkness in the blink of an eye. Ha 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 ha! Aaliyah's rough laughter came from one side. Brund looked in that direction and saw that his companion's mouth was full of blood. He had actually bitten a wolf to death. He laughed loudly and said, "They bite me, I bite them. What is fairness? This is fairness. That's why I like to fight. Here everyone is equal regardless of background." Brund. His neck was wrapped in thick gauze. He was swaying and his face was as pale as paper. Blood continued to seep out from where he was injured last night, but this did not stop his violent temper and loud voice. In fact, someone had stopped him from getting up from the stretcher to participate in the battle. Brund frowned. "Where is your upbringing, Aaliyah?" "I only have upbringing for upbringing. Who would talk to a dog about upbringing?" Aaliyah replied indifferently. "This is not a dog, this is a wolf." Rollo corrected. "It's all the same." Brund was too lazy to pay attention to these two guys. He shook off the beads of blood flowing on the dark steel blade and looked around. The forest was like a dark hole of illusion. The shadows of white beasts far and near were everywhere. And in the farther direction, the elegant stag was resting on a snow-white rock, as if waiting for them to move on. Since tracking it, they had been trekking in the snow for hours on end, and the winter wolves had been tracking them in the forest all night. Everyone was cold and sleepy, relying only on their willpower to support themselves. Like the Erewhon people, the Cruz people were superstitious that these rare and elegant creatures in the forest would bring good luck, and the stag did lead them all night to find a path to move forward in the dark forest, as if they were blessed by the gods. However, the good times did not last long. At this moment, the sky was gradually brightening, and the first rays of dawn appeared on the eastern horizon. Everyone could see a long white wall in the sky a few miles away. A glacial cliff stretched across the canopy of the forest, its crystalline ice surface sparkling under the morning sun. The glacier pressed heavily on Brund's chest, making his heart pound. Was there really a way ahead? Freya panted slightly. Her bright light brown eyes were also full of doubts. "Ladies, I'm afraid there's no way ahead. What should we do next?" A knight of the Folded Sword Regiment shouted. "No way, the glacier can't be endless. Since the stag has brought us here, it means there must be a way to get around it. Little Pero replied. The sickly young cruiseman was wrapped in a thick bearskin coat, holding a rapier in one hand and a crossbow in the other, but he was not inferior to his companions in battle. Many winter wolves had fallen at his feet, and every wound was a fatal blow. Seeing that the others had shifted their gaze to him, Little Pero continued to answer slowly. As long as we find the natural edge of these broken glaciers. Will there be? Freya could not help but blurt out, and then covered her mouth. Such unconfident words did not seem to come from the mouth of a commander. There will be. Little Pero only glanced at Freya and replied with certainty. If it is indeed a naturally formed glacier. What if it isn't? Aaliyah stepped up 2 steps to catch up from behind, just in time to hear the conversation. The sickly young man glanced at him and did not answer. Aaliyah opened his mouth. He was not afraid of Brund, who came from a great aristocratic family, and could even be neither servile nor overbearing in front of the eldest son of the emperor. But only in front of Little Pero. He could not lift his head like a mouse seeing a cat. Even he himself could not figure out the reason. But that did not mean that his big mouth could stop talking. He thought for a moment and complained. If you ask me, we shouldn't have trusted a stag. I really don't know what's going on in your heads. I'm sorry, this is my decision. Freya stood up and replied. I'm not targeting you, Sir Commander. I'm just a little surprised that so many of us seem to be possessed, and no one raised any objections at the time. Aaliyah replied. The commander lady from Erewhon was far less powerful than them, and her tactical level could only be said to be average, but that did not mean they could not disrespect her. If it were not for the investigation of the cause of Anika's death, she would not have fallen into a trap and fallen into this situation. At least she had the awareness and courage of a commander, which was a feeling they often felt from Veronica. This is the strange part of the whole thing. After repelling a wave of attacks from the winter wolves, Brund also came over. Aaliyah, we cruise people and Erewhon people grew up listening to the legend of the stag. The stag in the dark forest is the same as the unicorn, the embodiment of kindness and order. They once guided the Flame King and Eric, and today they have come to guide us again. You did not stand up against it at the time because you agreed with this from the bottom of your heart. Nonsense. The rugged knight curled his lips. Aaliyah, it's understandable that you Aenir people have never heard of the legend of the stag. Brund chuckled. But you have to admit that there are some mysterious and inexplicable things in this world. Only then did Freya notice that Aaliyah did seem to have some Aenir blood, as evidenced by the light blonde curly hair and long and narrow nasal cavity. He also had a strong local accent when he spoke. This knight looked like he was from Fanzan or a race further north. But Aaliyah jumped up as if he had been poked in the foot. Brund, what do you mean by that? As I said, if you were a little more confident, you wouldn't treat your origin and bloodline as an attack, Brund replied nonchalantly. Humph. The former snorted heavily, but did not answer. Freya had become accustomed to the quarrel between the two men this night, but even if they were to argue for a reason, it would not help to solve the current predicament. What they had to do now was to completely curb the attack of the wolves. In any case, we have to defeat them first, then bypass the glacier and continue north. Freya paused and said to the others, if possible, meet up with Brando and Lady Veronica. But it's too difficult to get rid of the wolves in the forest. Rollo frowned and shook his head. How do you know if you don't try? Aaliyah turned back and replied nonchalantly. You don't know wolves, Aaliyah, you don't know how cunning they are. That's natural, I'm not a mountain man, how would I know these beasts? He spread out his hands in amusement. The dark-skinned mountain knight stared at the former without saying a word. Exactly. The girl from the countryside of Butchie pulled off her cloak. That's why we need to fight back. We can't get rid of them if we get entangled with them. We have to take the initiative to attack and defeat them until they don't dare to chase us anymore. Little Pero saw Freya tying her cloak to a spear and immediately understood what she was thinking. It's too risky. If you risk exposing your position, maybe the silver monster is lying in ambush, it's obviously coming for you. Freya hesitated for a moment. There's no way to think about it anymore, we're all exhausted. I don't want to be driven forward by the wolves like this, waiting for death when we're too tired to walk. She raised the flag in her hand. I'm the commander, and I'll lead everyone to break through the encirclement. If I fall, You will take over my flag and pass the information of the monster to Brendel and Lady Veronica. You're just an apprentice, Commander. A slightly cold voice came from behind, and then Freya felt someone holding the spear in her hand. She was slightly startled and looked back to see Maynard's expressionless face. Senior Maynard? Leave the flag to me. The black-haired female knight gently took the simple battle flag from her hand. You give the order. Senior. Don't talk nonsense, give the order. Freya took a deep breath, she looked back at the others, and little Pero and Brund both nodded to her. Her gaze swept across the undulating forest and snowfield, and she had a plan in mind. Descendants of the Flame King, the Knight of Cruz with the flag as the center, the two wings close to the center. The girl's clear voice rang through the forest, and all the knights of the Folded Sword Regiment turned their heads in amazement. A silver flag had been erected in the forest. It was clearly a cloak that fluttered in the morning breeze. The cloak was also embroidered with the emblem of the White Lion. Knights, prepare to attack. P.S. This chapter is a little less laggy. I'll try to speed up the update. Also, I'll continue to recommend Blackie's new book, Cataclysm Descends, book number 2959961. It's still a new book at the moment, please help support it. Those with votes vote, those without votes click on it. Chapter 795. The snow-covered woodland seemed to have experienced a fierce battle. The snow and bushes were full of corpses of winter wolves. The corpses were turning into black particles, dissipating like black smoke. The victors of the battle obviously belonged to the other side that was not lying on the battlefield. The human knight from Cruz. Joachim looked at this scene expressionlessly, while slowly moving along the open space between the woodland. Katja! A leather boot stepped into the snow. Damn it! Joachim cursed in a low voice. He frowned, lifted his foot, took off his boot, patted the boot to shake out the snow inside, and then put it on again. A grayish-white winter wolf came out of the bushes and whimpered a few times at him. Joachim looked up and rubbed his chin. About a quarter of an hour? They have fled to the north? Who are they, the people from Cruz? I think so. There is no one else in this forest except them. Don't worry, they are just stubborn. They can't run far. The winter wolf whimpered in a low voice. Joachim seemed to understand what the beast wanted to express and stroked its forehead with his hand. Although he was no longer as arrogant as he was an Ampere seal, he had indeed been killed once in that war. He had died under the swords of the disorderly soldiers when he was fleeing, and the injury he had suffered at that time had left an indelible scar on his body. Right now his skin was as white as paper, lacking luster and moisture. His exposed arms and palms were so shriveled that they looked terrifying like skeletons. One of his eyes was permanently blind, so he wore an eye patch with a hollow skull pattern on it to cover it. There was also a fatal wound on his chest, caused by a heavy sword that had not healed yet. The gap under the wound led to the ribs and pierced his heart, but the heart that was once born as a human had long decayed and no longer pulsed. Instead, it was replaced by a blazing white flame. All of this was because of the deal he made with those unnamed beings when he was alive. They promised him the power of immortality, and he did enjoy this power after death, but in a different way. He became an undead. Only after becoming an undead could he understand how painful it was to be immortal. His soul fire was constantly burning his memories of the past. Pain, regret, anger, sorrow, and all sorts of negative emotions lingered in his heart, tormenting him day and night. Day after day, human emotions were gradually worn away. Only cold hatred for the past was left in their minds. Although he had become an undead, it wasn't as if he had gained nothing. Those unknown existences had indeed fulfilled their promise and given him power. Summoning the winter wolves in the forest was just one of them. This was a power that was far beyond the mortal world. It was completely different from the shallow power that humans had built on authority. It was a real power that could be controlled. More and more winter wolves appeared in the forest like ghosts. The wolves split into small groups and ran in all directions. Joachim listened attentively, and soon there was a long howl in the distance. He sneered. His pets had found the other party's trace. In the open space in the forest, several winter wolves circled around the bodies of their companions. They raised their heads as if they were smelling the blood in the air. Then the leading wolf let out a long howl and turned to chase in one direction. Such a scene was playing out everywhere. The wolves soon found more traces. The bodies were buried under the snow, in the thorny bushes, and some were even hidden on the trunks. Along the way to the north, there were more and more traces of such battles. As if sketching out such a scene, the crew's knight fought and retreated, but they could never get rid of the wolves' pursuit. Marquis Joachim followed behind his pack of wolves and examined each corpse one by one. The sword wounds on the corpses confirmed his conjecture. At first, the Kurlutzians still had time to dispose of the corpses or bury them under the snow, but later, they had to leave the battlefield hastily and leave the bodies of the winter wolves in the forest. Moving forward, the young men simply fled the battlefield. Most of the bodies of the winter wolves stayed in the position where they were killed. This meant that the crew's people had no time to dispose of the bodies. They were fleeing in panic. On the other hand, it also meant that the wolves were getting closer and closer to them. Joachim followed unhurriedly. He sometimes had time to look up at the bright glacier in the north. If the other party knew the real name of the glacier, they would regret their choice. It was not a natural glacier, but the outer wall of the holy cathedral of the hibernator buried by the glacier. To get around the wall, they would have to go around the entire central area of Milo's breath. About a quarter of an hour later, the wolves stopped in front as if they had found something. Joachim separated the pack and walked to where they stopped. After he saw what his pets had found, he could not help but smile like a winner. It was footprints. A long series of footprints was so eye-catching in the snow. The footprints left by the cruise people went all the way into the Elson black pine forest in front of them in a panic. They don't even have time to clean up the footprints. Seems that they have noticed me. Joachim thought for a moment and snapped his fingers. He let the wolves spread out, and like a large net, they filtered through the entire forest in front of them. Freya and the others struggled through the black pine forest, and the steep ice wall was already in front of them. The blue stag was still leading the way. It moved vigorously along the broken ice zone at the edge of the glacier, jumping from one sloping ice surface to another, never slipping or losing its balance. It was as steady as walking on flat ground. But this road was a bit difficult for the young people of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment. Even though almost every one of them was a master in the gold realm, and there was no lack of gold-level strength like Brund, there were still people who slipped from time to time. Due to Freya's own meager strength, Maynard and little Pero took special care of her. But even so, she still fell several times. The first time she fell, she hurt her arm, and the second time she knocked her forehead, so that it still looked red, as if she was about to cry at any time, which made her very embarrassed. Because of this, the speed of the team's progress became slower and slower, and everyone seemed a little silent. Not only did this steep glacial cliff seem to have no end, but also because the forest was getting quieter, which meant that the white demons had begun to pass through the black pine forest behind them. Crack! Brund casually threw the frozen stone-like dry food into the snow, splashing a cloud of snowflakes. He saw the lump of food roll down the steep terrain, and finally fell into an ice crevice and disappeared. If they fell here, everyone might face the same danger. Those ice crevices were connected to the bottomless glaciers, and if they accidentally lost their footing, there was no hope of climbing up by themselves. Not to mention a place like Milo's Breath. Even in the Great Glacier east of Fanzan, there were countless adventurers who disappeared under the glacier every year. He felt cold and hungry, and his eyelids were as heavy as lead, but unfortunately, they did not have time to stop for a little rest, let alone make a fire. How long is this deer going to take us along this glacier? If we go on like this, we'll be caught by the winter wolves behind us. Aaliyah could not help but complain again. It took us a lot of effort to drive them away. No one will think you're mute if you shut up. Brund replied snappily. He didn't know where this guy found so much nonsense. The wolves will also slow down when they cross the glacier. Only that guy can walk leisurely in this kind of terrain. As he said this, he stared at the blue shadow in front of him. But it was at this moment that someone in the team suddenly let out a low cry. Look over there. Aaliyah was about to retort, but when he heard this low cry, he could not help but turn his head. Everyone, including him, saw a few white shadows appear at the edge of the black forest in the distance. They were obviously wolves, and they had apparently discovered the traces of the cruise people trekking on the edge of the cliff. They glanced over from afar, then turned around and went back into the forest. Oh hell, what do you have to say now? Aaliyah looked back at Brund with a gloating expression. What's there to be happy about for you? Although he said so sarcastically, Brun still smacked his lips and muttered to himself, "How could it be so fast?" "Ha ha," Aaliyah laughed as if he was not afraid of death. "To be able to see you suffer, I have no regrets even if I die. If you want to die, you can jump from here, Aaliyah." Little Pero listened to this guy's words getting more and more outrageous, and finally said coldly, "No one will hold you back." Strangely enough, as soon as the short cruise young man from Vincennes opened his mouth, Aaliyah immediately shut up. He laughed awkwardly. "I'm just saying. Besides, I really can't walk anymore. If the commander orders me to stop and cover the rear, I definitely won't refuse. I'll have a good fight with those beasts." "There's no need." Freya did not know whether to laugh or cry. She really admired little Pero for being able to discipline such a guy into obedience. When she was the captain of the militia, there were also some slippery bastards in the team, but compared to Aaliyah they paled in comparison. The cruise knight in front of her really subverted her impression of the cruise people. It stopped. While everyone was arguing, Lolo was the only one who was still staring ahead. At this time he suddenly saw the beautiful blue creature stop near an ice wall in front of him. It looked at the human side, as if to tell them that they had arrived at their destination. What happened next caught everyone's attention. "Let's go and have a look." Little Pero spoke first. So Aaliyah and Brund also stopped arguing and the team moved on. About a quarter of an hour later, they arrived at the place. But the next moment, everyone was stunned. When they got closer, they found that the glacier had caved in here, forming a narrow canyon. The misty canyon, like a crack split by lightning, appeared in front of the people of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment. P.S. From today onwards, it is officially confirmed that the normal update has been resumed. I probably found the problem. Feel around. In addition, continue to recommend Blackie's new book, Disaster Descends. This book is well written and is currently rushing to the signing list. If you have the ability to support it, help him get recommendation tickets and clicks. Chapter 797. The mist-filled canyon, like a crack split by lightning, appeared in front of the crowd of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment. This crack divided the entire glacier, making the mortals look incomparably small in front of this masterpiece of nature. When Freya looked up at the fragmented section of the glacier, she felt as small as the dust at the feet of a giant. The long and narrow crack stretched for several miles, forming a winding path between the intersecting and slanting ice. On the cliffs on both sides, layers of ice, icicles and icicles formed, making the entire canyon look as intricate as a maze. "This is spectacular," Brund muttered to himself, and behind him, the young knight from Cruz also looked at the scene with amazement. "Where's the stag?" Faced with such a scene, Aaliyah had to admit that they had been following the stag for some time. But even so, it could not change his stubbornness. "It went in." The mountain knight Rollo replied affirmatively. "But I don't see its shadow now. Does it want us to go in?" "That's not very good. There are traps under these ice walls, reminding me of the dangerous wilderness valleys in the Sukalas Valley when we were training. As the master, even if it doesn't stay to lead the way for us, it should at least say please. Besides, God knows how long this canyon is. What if it's a dead end inside?" Aaliyah asked rhetorically. Rollo glanced at him and was too lazy to argue with this guy. In the end, it was little Pero who came out to calm the situation. "Well, Aaliyah is right. Although the Holy Spirit guided us here, we still don't know what's ahead. I suggest that we split up a scout team from the team, just like we did when we were training in the winding valleys of Sukalas." Brund frowned. "But we were doing survival training at that time, and now we have a pack of winter wolves trailing behind us. Wouldn't it be too slow if we split up a scout team and groped our way forward? We can only make this choice. The terrain in the canyon is intricate like a maze, and it won't be easier for those winter wolves to track our tracks inside than outside." Little Pero shrunk under his bearskin coat and shook his head slowly. "Let's see what the commander has to say." Everyone turned to look at Freya, only to find that the Erewhon girl was staring at the 10,000-year-old glacier in a daze. Her gaze had long drifted off somewhere. She stood there, as if listening and looking, as if something in the ice was talking to her. And it was not until little Pero called her 2 or 3 times that she came to her senses. What's wrong?" Freya was slightly startled and looked at the others. "What happened just now? The wolves have caught up?" "No, I didn't." Brund shook his head. But you, Sir Commander, what happened? Did you notice anything? Freya looked suspiciously at the blue steel-like glacier. She had indeed discovered something, but that wasn't the main reason for her absent-mindedness. She felt like something had happened, but she couldn't remember what it was. She thought for a moment and slowly shook her head. Regarding everyone's opinions, I do have an idea. I just don't know what Mr. Little Perro and Senior Maynold suggest. Maynold looked at her, and Little Perro replied directly, "Just say it, Mum. I want to ambush Marquis Yoakum." "What?" Before Little Perro could speak, Brund blurted out in surprise, because in his opinion, the Lady Commander's performance had been nothing more than mediocre. Although she had some convincing qualities when it came to brains, not to mention Little Perro, who was recognized as the brains of the knights, she was even slightly inferior to himself. In fact, her previous performance had also illustrated this point. Her command of several battles was like the most standard textbook. That is, you could neither find any highlights nor faults. He could not imagine why she would suddenly come up with such a risky and radical idea. It was simply not like two things done by one person. Little Perro was also silent for a moment. This time, it was Maynold who spoke after a moment of consideration. The woman, who graduated from Erewhon's Royal Knight Academy with the best grades and quickly became an official knight and was promoted to captain of knights, asked in her usual cold tone, "Why do you think so?" "Actually, I've always had this idea, Senior Maynold." Freya's tone softened a little in the face of this stern senior, as if the majesty she had accumulated with great difficulty had turned back into the little girl from the countryside of Bucci in an instant. She said weakly, "It's just that I haven't found a good opportunity before. The terrain here is very much to my liking." Erewhon's infantry tactical drill said, "Don't worry about the drill, tell me what you think." Maynold sighed and interrupted her a little impatiently. Looking at the conversation between the two, the young people from Cruz could not help but laugh. They really could not imagine that such a weak commander could lead them to this place. Even in the Cruz Empire, these guys were labeled as unruly. Other than being obedient under Veronica's command, most of the superiors who had been in charge of them would probably put them on the list of headache-inducing existences, which they were proud of. But it had to be said that sometimes, people's encounters were very strange. Probably feeling that some of the Cruz Knights' shoulders were shaking, Freya blushed, but she still answered seriously, "Yes, Senior. After all, the winter wolves are monsters. If we find a way to kill the person who commands them, then they can hardly pose a threat to us anymore. We can't always be on the run in this world of ice and snow." "How can you say that we're on the run? We're carrying out the established tactics." Aaliyah hurriedly corrected her, but because his movement was too big, it affected his wound, causing him to grimace in pain. "The Folded Sword Knight Regiment will never run away from the enemy, Sir Commander. You have to remember this." "You shut up. The Folded Sword Knight Regiment does not defeat the enemy by bragging." Brund glanced at the guy, then turned back and asked, "But the question is whether we can kill him, Sir Commander. This is risky. That guy obviously won't appear at the front of the wolf pack. If we can't succeed in one blow, we may be surrounded by the wolf pack. What's more," he hesitated, "what if the silver monster is with him? I say, boy, how can you achieve great things by being overly cautious?" Hearing Brund's objection, Aaliyah immediately sang the opposite tune. "Things on the battlefield are all about luck. If you can predict the enemy 100%, then what's the point of fighting a war? Why don't you just ask him to send a messenger to surrender?" "Haha, that guy might really send a wolf to surrender to you, Brund. Do you understand the wolf language?" the guy asked gloatingly. "It doesn't matter if I understand wolf language or not. What matters is that you just opposed it and now you support it. Aaliyah, can you Anir people not be so two-faced?" Brund was finally angered by this guy's provocation and could not help but sneer coldly. Aaliyah, however, did not care and replied indifferently, "That was just now, and now is now. Just now you supported it, so naturally I had to oppose it. Now that you're against it, I'm going to support it. What, do you have any dissatisfaction?" "I don't have time to be dissatisfied with a guy like you." Brund was so angry that he wanted to say something else, but was interrupted by Little Perro. The short Cruz Knight put his hands in the sleeves of his bearskin coat, and at first it was as if he did not hear the argument between Brund and Aaliyah. It was not until now that he spoke. "Everything else is fine, but have you thought about what to do with the silver monster?" This problem was also a problem that plagued the entire Folded Sword Knight Order. If it was just the Winter Wolf and Marquis Yokum, they would have turned around and fought their way out. But the problem was that the elusive silver monster was too terrifying. And in the battle the night before, it left a deep impression on everyone. Even Freya, who proposed it, could not help but fall silent when she heard this question. Was the silver monster there or not, and if it was, what should be done with it? Lucky guy. Yokum could not help but sigh as he stood at the crack of the glacier, looking up to admire the majestic natural beauty. He unconsciously turned the emerald on the ring snake ring, just like when he was still in his castle. He would do some subconscious little movements when he was thinking, as if it would help him calm down. It was just that the cold wind here could not be connected to the pleasant climate of his territory near the Grey Mountain, and the owner of the ring no longer needed such little movements to keep calm. The undead's mind was as cold as ice, and this was just a habitual action. Before the wolves discovered the rift, he couldn't believe that this group of Kurlutzians could find such an exit so coincidentally. Who would have thought that this group of Kurlutzian knights could find the only rift outside the holy cathedral of the Hibernator by accident? White Gorge, this should be the name of this place. Before the cruise people arrived here, he and Erek had spent several days looking for this crack, but in the end they found nothing and had to go back through the main gate guarded by the Frost Dragon. Who would have thought that he would actually find this place in the midst of this chase? Although he was a little upset that the cruise people had escaped again, he was also a little surprised to find this shortcut, and even felt that it was an unexpected gain. At this time, several wolves emerged from under the glacier. They howled a few times at Marquis Yokum, who quickly understood the meaning of his pets. The cruise people really entered the canyon. They are really bold. Yokum curled his lips. But forget it, it doesn't matter. They can walk for a while but not forever. They will soon understand that only you are the masters of the glacier. I'd like to see how far those lucky guys can run. 2 winter wolves came to his side, and Yokum stroked their silver mane with his cold and dry palms and sneered. Let's go, this hunt is far from over. The winter wolf seemed to understand his words and lowered its head and whimpered a few times. Yokum heard the whimpers of his pets and frowned. Don't worry about that guy, he is a lunatic, a psychopath. They are just the servants of the Twilight Dragon, and they are self-righteous. Don't think that others don't know that they have been defeated once in ancient times. If their race is really as powerful as they boast, how could they be defeated by the Azure Knight? In the end, they still have to rely on our strength. All things become one. How could those guys who only know how to kill and only know how to use brute force understand that they are nothing more than fighting creatures created by chaos? He patted his pet's forehead. Of course I understand. That little girl may be a little strange. I have heard rumors about her. I suspect that she is the daughter of the Earth Knight, Everton. Oh, the royal faction claims that the traitor is dead, thinking that we don't know about their clumsy lies. But it doesn't matter, our first goal is still to kill those Cruise Knight. Letting them stay with Veronica is a hidden danger, which is something that the old guy Erek doesn't want to see. As for that little girl, she can't escape anyway. Go, my pet. Chase them until they have no way to escape. Yokum said loudly. He looked up but did not realize that behind the layers of ice walls above his head, in the crevices of the glacier, sharp arrows were placed on longbows, moving in the direction he was moving. At this moment, even Aaliyah, who had been chattering incessantly, held his breath, and all the Folded Sword Knights hiding on the ice wall looked nervously at the winter wolves around Yokum that were like a rolling torrent. The wolves were crossing the marquee and entering the canyon. Fortunately we stayed. Brund was an orthodox knight. Although he had learned archery, he was not good at it. So at this moment he stood behind everyone with a long sword in his hand, and when he saw such a scene, he could not help but wipe his cold sweat. If we continue to run, we will be surrounded sooner or later. It was not until this moment that he really looked at Freya with some admiration. But at this moment, the girl from the countryside of Butchie frowned deeper than everyone else. She did not expect that the number of winter wolves would be so large. 1. The Sukras Valley, located in the north of Cruz, was the natural habitat of the petrifying lizards. It was the existence of the Cruz Empire as a military-restricted area all year round, but contrary to other people's speculation of a training ground, this place was actually a high-quality crystal mine. But since the Empire discovered this place in the Year of Thunder, There had been no way to defeat the petrifying lizards and steadily mine high-quality magic crystals from here. Chapter 798. Freya bit her lip as she watched the wolves gather in the canyon, and then suddenly disperse, revealing something in the middle. It was a few wolf corpses stacked on top of each other, and traces of a fierce battle were scattered around the snow. This was arranged in advance to ensure that Joachim could enter their optimal shooting range. After discovering these corpses, Joachim walked over slowly. For giant wolves the size of heavy warhorses surrounded him. They were the ghosts of the winter that often appeared in folktales, the children of Ekis, the Pale Sons, who were far more terrifying than the winter wolves in this forest. "Are you sure?" Brund asked with a sigh of relief when he saw Joachim squatting down beside the wolf corpses and began to examine them. "We can try," Lolo replied. After a simple question and answer, the folded sword knight made the final adjustments. They took a deep breath, held their breath, kept their hands holding the bow steady, and then slowly pushed the bow to the string. The bow creaked. Most of the bows suitable for the strength of the gold rank were magic bows. Only composite bows treated with the laws of strengthening and toughening could withstand 100 times the strength of an ordinary person. But even so, every time the bow was drawn, it was still equivalent to the loss of the bow's lifespan. This loss was irreversible. In Erewhon, a magic bow could even be bought for 17,000 tor per bow. Even if it was the work of the masters in the workshops directly under the royal family, most of these bows would not be drawn more than 100 times. Every time the bow was drawn, it was almost equivalent to squandering the weight of the bow. There was no wind in the canyon and Joachim was still unaware, but it was as if there was a natural sensitivity to danger that made him look up. His subtle movement seemed to touch the tense nerves of the crew's people. Little Pero looked at Freya, and the latter nodded gently. Freya exhaled softly, as if to calm herself down. "Shoot!" Almost at the same time, Maynard gave the order to attack in a cold voice. The archers released their bowstrings one after another. The power attached to the arrows was so great that when they left the bowstrings, they let out a deafening hum. Wherever the arrows passed, the air surged. From afar it looked like the space was shaking. The first arrow flew over the flank of the winter wolves, and the whirlwind it created blew the wolves off their feet. Under such an attack, Joachim had no time to react. He had just turned his head, and the arrow was already in front of him. Everyone could see his panicked and incredulous face. The giant wolf beside him saved his life. The huge pale sun leaped up and blocked the path of the arrow. Then the arrow hit one side of its back. The huge impact directly penetrated the pale sun into the snow, splashing snow everywhere. The rain of arrows fell. The 4 pale suns around Joachim were instantly shot like hedgehogs, but at least they had bought time for the Marquis, allowing him to finally realize what had happened. He never dreamed that those days Crew's Knight would dare to take the initiative to attack him, and by the time he realized this, everything had become irreparable. Joachim immediately got down and hid among the winter wolves. He tried to retreat to the other side of the canyon to find a place to hide. But unfortunately, the ambush point that little Pero and Maynard chose for him was surrounded by flat ground. The small group of winter wolves that had previously surrounded him quickly fell down one by one, while more winter wolves were still far away on the flanks or had already chased into the canyon. Joachim began to regret it. He should not have been so rash, but it was too late to say anything now. But when the wolves gradually became sparse, an arrow hit him. He screamed and fell into the snow. The arrow pierced his left calf and nailed him to the ground. If he was still alive, he would be sweating in pain at this moment, but one of the benefits of the undead was that they lost their sense of pain. Joachim hurriedly gritted his teeth and turned back, pulling out the sword at his waist, trying to cut off the long feather arrow that nailed him to the ground. At the same time, the wolves in the canyon finally discovered the attackers. The wolves in the pack let out howls one after another, and the closer wolves had begun to turn around and pounce on the Crew's Knight above the cliff. The closer winter wolves, on the other hand, rushed to Marquis Joachim, trying to protect their master. Brundalia, lead the team to stop them. Freya stared at the winter wolves all over the mountains and plains, rushing towards their position like a reverse avalanche. This scene was so similar to what she had seen in Ampere Seal, as if it had happened yesterday. The Valkyrie clenched the sword in her hand. It was impossible to say that she was not nervous. After all, she was just a knight captain at that time. At this moment, her every order determined whether everyone present would be buried here or escape alive. She clenched her hand so hard that her knuckles turned white because of the loss of blood, but she did not notice it herself. Thousands of winter wolves were less than 100 feet away from them, and with the speed of the winter wolves, it would only take 2 breaths to rush in front of them. The snowy wolf pack, in which every beast bared its fangs that gleamed with a cold light, were clearly visible. Lolo, prepare for the second round of shooting. Freya took a deep breath and tried to keep her voice as calm as possible as she ordered. Lolo licked his lips. Even for the people of Cruz, such a big scene was not often seen, not to mention that they were just some newbies. The battle in front of them even surpassed the battle that broke out last night, and when the wolves charged in the open terrain outside the forest, the momentum was by no means the same. Including him, everyone's palms were oozing with a thin layer of oily sweat. However, their daily training worked, and the young knights of Cruz raised their longbows in unison. Just as they drew their bows, the knight in the back row had already picked up his shield and stepped out with his longsword in hand. They were 20 steps away from the front line and formed a thin blocking formation, led by Brund and Aaliyah. The wolves were less than 50 feet away. The knights put down their long shields and inserted the pointed end of the shield into the snow. The center of gravity of their bodies was also lowered, ready to receive the impact. Lolo narrowed his eyes and raised the longbow in his hand a little higher. His line of sight was always raised, over a line of rushing wolves, and the arrow cluster that gleamed with a cold light was still aimed at the bottom of the canyon. Release! Maynard waited until all the archers had adjusted and immediately issued an order. At the same time, Joachim finally turned around and cut off the arrow stuck in his left leg with the sword. Although the undead did not feel pain, it did not mean that he would not be troubled by pain. The loss of soul power almost made him suck in a breath of cold air. After doing this, he did not rush to escape. Instead, he threw down the long sword in his hand somewhat dispiritedly, turned over with difficulty, and then looked at the sky. Joachim's pale eyes flashed with a gray light. The expression inside was both madness and despair. In his field of vision above the sky, arrows fell like rain. He opened his mouth, revealing his white teeth, as if he was making a final cry, but there was no sound. Almost in an instant, more than 20 arrows nailed him to the ground together with the winter wolf that had just arrived. Joachim raised his head, persisted for the last moment, and then lay down dejectedly. When the winter wolf collided with the knight's shield, there was a dull thud. The impact of these beasts was so great that if it were an ordinary human soldier, he would have been blown away at this moment. When the Duke of Longblade fought against the large-scale movements of the tundra wolves on the plateau, he often needed to arrange his soldiers in a large square of 7 rows, far beyond the extent of fighting against heavy cavalry. But the winter wolves were also facing extraordinary opponents. The dozens of Cruz knight in the front row were all gold rankers. In front of them, the winter wolves were not much different from ordinary wolves. The knight used their shields to lift the wolves that crashed into them, or nailed them to the snow with their swords, and then took a step back, waiting for the second attack. Unlike Aaliyah, who was slashing and killing, Brund was carefully calculating the distance they would retreat. According to his calculations, they would have to hold on for at least 5 rounds of attacks. Before that, they had to buy enough time, the more the better. But after the third impact, the Cruz knights suddenly felt that their vision was empty, and the repulsed winter wolves did not rush up again. What's going on? Everyone subconsciously looked down at the canyon below. In the misty fog, countless white beasts were fleeing in all directions. It was not until this moment that the archers in the back cheered. Little Pero, Maynard, and Freya all looked nervously at the place where Joachim had fallen, because no one could say for sure whether the winter wolves would leave after Joachim's death. The only thing they could count on was that at least after losing their commander, the winter wolves would only have the instincts of wild beasts. At least they would not act in an orderly manner like an army. It was undoubtedly a fantasy to break out of the encirclement of an army, but if the opponent was just a group of beasts acting on instinct, then it might not be so. But the reality was far better than they imagined. At the moment when Joachim fell, although there were still a small number of winter wolves attacking them, but further away, the large-scale wolves had begun to show signs of hesitation and scattering. The crew's knight with longbows were the first to notice this sign and could not help but cheer in unison. Then little Pero could not help but breathe a sigh of relief. He turned back and congratulated Freya, half relaxed and half glad. "It seems that we made the right bet, Commander." Freya just nodded slightly. Joachim was dead, and everyone saw it with their own eyes. The wolves were also collapsing, and although there were still a small number of them who were still entangled with them, their numbers were no threat to them at all. But even so, she was still a little worried. There was only one problem. The premise of their ambush was if the silver monster was not with Joachim. What if the monster was lurking around? No one could say for sure. Maynard was keenly aware of her junior's worries. She looked back at the latter and asked, "What's wrong?" "I'm a little worried," Freya replied. "Senior Maynard, I think we'd better get out of here as soon as possible." "Are you worried about the monster?" Little Pero also thought of this question. "But if it's here, it wouldn't let Joachim be ambushed by us, would it?" "I don't know." Freya shook her head gently. "But I have a hunch that something is wrong." "You're too nervous, Commander." Little Pero shook his head. He had received professional military training. For soldiers, hunches were probably the most unbelievable thing. But Maynard's judgment was the opposite of his. The female knight frowned and asked, "A hunch? Did you miss something?" Freya was slightly startled. She looked at her senior with some surprise. She did not expect the other party to be so clear about what she was thinking. It was this feeling that she always felt that she had missed something. Maynard stared at her and did not speak. But if Brando was here, he would be doubly vigilant. The Valkyrie's hunch was a very famous rumor in his world. Oh! Chapter 799. A small team of crew's knights climbed down the steep glacial cliff and slowly approached Joachim's body. The body was nailed to the ground in a strange posture by the huge impact of the arrow. The undead had long since died. Its eye sockets were dark and its soul flame had been extinguished. The leading knight could not help but let out a long sigh of relief. His warm breath weaved into a thin white mist in the cold canyon, and quickly blended into the surrounding icy mist. The wolves had long retreated, and there were still some wolf corpses left around, stained with blood, and broken arrows all over the ground. The canyon was eerily quiet. He should have reported immediately after confirming Joachim's death, but this strange silence made him look around again. In a trance, he seemed to see something standing in the depths of the canyon. A beast the size of a pony stood behind the mist, its hair moving without wind. He jumped in fright and looked over, only to find that there was nothing there. The beast he thought was just the mist floating in the deep canyon. But even so, the knight could not help but break out in a cold sweat. After the short ambush, the canyon fell into this strange atmosphere. The current situation seemed to be more terrible than when they were still being chased by the wolves. The captain of the knight took a deep breath and seemed to be ready to stabilize his emotions. He was a member of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment, one of the best of the younger generation of crews. It would be too embarrassing to be frightened by a quiet canyon. But just as he was about to let out a breath, he realized that something seemed to be wrong around him. Captain? A stammering voice sounded behind him. It was the voice of his subordinate. The knight suddenly looked up and unknowingly, a pair of cold yellow eyes had appeared in front of him. Wool dash. Little Pero, Brund and Maynard, everyone was silently waiting for the reassuring news from below, but what they waited for was a scream of panic. Clack! With a soft sound, a silver-maned monster jumped down from somewhere and landed in front of everyone. It was the pale sun. The anxiety and uneasiness in Freya's heart seemed to have become reality in an instant. Everyone knew that Joachim was driving the winter wolf forward, and it was the silver monster who was controlling the pale sun. 2, 3, one after another, the monsters fell from above and landed around the Kurletzian knights. They did not make any threatening growls, nor did they advance prematurely. They just surrounded them, raised their heads and stared at the humans with cold eyes. Those eyes were full of wisdom that should not belong to a beast, but it was precisely because of this that they felt a chill from the bottom of their hearts. Freya was the first to react. She raised her head, her light brown pupils shrinking slightly against the morning sun. Sure enough, she saw a few white figures appearing at the top of the glacier that was reflecting the light. Unknowingly, these pale suns had already run above them. In other words, when they were still full of confidence in ambushing Yokum, these monsters had already begun their encirclement. How could this be? Since the second half of last night, these pale suns and the silver monster had not appeared again. Everyone believed that they had separated from Yokum, but now it seemed that they had arrived here first. The girl from Buchi felt a chill in her heart. Could it be that the Folded Sword Knight Regiment lied to her? But what good would it do them? She shook her head hard to throw this ridiculous idea out of her mind. The cruise people were in the same boat as her at the moment, so it was unlikely that they would lie about this issue. That is to say, their scouts really did not see the pale sun behind the winter wolf. She couldn't help but look at Brund. Brund's face was also green and white. Apparently he also thought of this. After Anika's death, he was the captain of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment scout team, and now it was obvious that there was a mistake in his work. Black Blade. Brund growled angrily. Captain, it's not my fault. I swear in the name of the Flame King that I never saw a pale sun among the winter wolves, except for the 4 around Yokum. The knight who was named explained in a low voice with an aggrieved look on his face. It's not his fault. Freya saw the reaction of the two and breathed a sigh of relief. She quickly stopped the quarrel in a low voice. These monsters have already circled above us, which means that they should have at least arrived before Yokum. But it doesn't make sense. In that case, why would they just watch Yokum die? I don't know. Maybe the silver monster has a conflict with Yokum. Aaliyah pressed his wound and stared at the monsters surrounding them. He shrugged. This was one of the possibilities, but Freya instinctively felt that this was not the truth of the matter. Monsters, there are so many of them. Shouts came from far below the canyon. Little Pero, Brund, Commander, be careful, they're coming for you. Then came the sound of fierce fighting, the sounds of people and beasts fighting intertwined. All the Kurlutzians in the front row subconsciously raised the swords in their hands. The long swords shone brightly in the cold air, confronting the white teeth of the giant demonic wolf not far away. The next moment, there was a sudden scream from the crowd. Everyone turned their heads, only to see that a pale sun had come among them at some point, biting off the arm of a knight with a folded sword. The knight clutched the bloody broken arm and stabbed the pale sun in the left eye with a backhand. The latter also let out a whine and hurriedly retreated. The knight next to him stepped forward to protect his companion. Be careful, they have invisibility spells. The knight with the broken arm gritted his teeth and shouted. Everyone's expression changed. Pay attention to your surroundings. Freya shouted. She remembered the tactics of the invisible ghosts she had seen in the forest, and instinctively felt that the fighting style of these invisible monsters might be the same. Sure enough, a giant beast suddenly appeared on her left. It was like a flowing transparent liquid in the air, opening its huge mouth and biting at her. But before it could bite, a blue light appeared on Freya's armor, blocking the fangs out of the light wall. Half-body armor of the Wind Empress. Brund let out a low cry. At this time, Maynold had already taken a step forward and stabbed her sword into the throat of the stunned beast. Ever since she met the crystal stag with Brando that night, with the help of the raw stone of strength, her progress had also improved by leaps and bounds. The golden flames burned fiercely in her body, and the luster of elemental strength was about to be born. And this sword was worthy of the female knight's rapid progress during this period of time. The tip of the sword flashed with a faint black light that was difficult for outsiders to detect. It broke through the dark magic protection around the pale sun's body, and pierced the monster's throat. The giant wolf didn't seem to think that it would die so easily. It struggled for a moment and then fell down with a crash. This is the armor he gave you, Maynold said as she pulled the long sword out of the giant wolf's mouth and wiped it on the silver mane. Yes. Although the half-body armor of the Wind Empress is a standard armor, it has been passed down for generations and is still priceless. It seems that he cares a lot about you. Maynold answered pointedly. She glanced at Freya, and the meaningful look in her eyes made the latter's heart pound. Freya sighed softly. If it wasn't for the half-body armor of the Wind Empress, the giant wolf's bite would have bitten her entire right shoulder, shoulder blade, and chest. She could almost imagine the coldness of the sharp teeth piercing through her body. She would have died without a doubt. Brando had saved her again. She couldn't even count how many times she had owed him. This was the first time she had owed him a favor. She gripped the sword in her hand and came back to her senses. She turned her head away, trying her best to avoid looking at her senior's strange gaze. She felt that there seemed to be some other meaning behind it, and she didn't know how to answer. At this time, the Knight and the Pale Sons were already fighting. The Pale Sons' surprise attack caused Cruz's people to suffer heavy losses, but it had to be said that it was thanks to Freya's previous reminder. Otherwise, the current situation would not be as simple as just heavy losses. However, even so, the folded sword knights were still scattered by the sudden appearance of the monsters. The Pale Sons that appeared from the invisibility spell seemed to be pouring out from all directions. These winter nightmares were not as weak and easily bullied as their close relatives. As dusk species, even after 1,000 years of decline, they still retained at least the strength of a peak silver to early gold rank. The Cruz Knight immediately fell into a bitter battle against these troublesome opponents. Or rather, it was somewhat inappropriate to say that it was a bitter battle, because from the beginning, the young folded sword knights were retreating in defeat and gradually lost their organization and connection. Freya was separated from Maynard, and soon only Aaliyah and Brund were left by her side. Even little Pero was nowhere to be seen. "Commander, which direction should we break through?" Aaliyah asked with narrowed eyes. Freya shook her head. The only choice they had at present was to move closer to the center of the canyon and see if they could gather others there. "I still haven't figured out where these damn things came from." Brund couldn't help but curse. "Blackblade can't be wrong. And if the silver monster was close to us, how could it just watch Yoakum die? Even if they have a conflict, it would be easy for it to kill us. Why would it play this game of hide and seek with us?" "I heard that cats have a habit of teasing mice," Aaliyah replied. "It's not a cat, and we're not mice," Brund retorted angrily. Freya listened to the conversation between the two and frowned. She was thinking the same thing. She raised her head and carefully observed the smooth fracture at the top of the glacier. From time to time, Pale Sons jumped down from it and landed in the middle of the crowd. Seeing this scene, she suddenly shuddered and thought of something. "Brund, do you remember the direction where those giant wolves came from?" "Commander, they came from above the glacier, it's obvious." "No, I mean last night." Brund's expression changed. "In the forest, they came from the forest." "They can't inhabit the forest. The forest is the territory of the winter wolves, and the two kinds of wolves can't live together. If there's such a glacier behind the forest—" "Wait, Commander, you mean?" Brund also reacted at once. "I remember Brando often told some legends about the deadly frost forest. In the center of the forest is a huge maze, which is the holy temple of the hibernator of Milos, the god of the frost giants. I suddenly remembered that this is not a glacier, but the outer wall of the holy temple of the hibernator. These monsters came from inside the temple." "What?" Aaliyah finally heard the conversation between the two. "You mean these monsters live here? This is their lair?" This news that others couldn't help but frown when they heard it sounded very happy to him. "Commander, you mean that the monsters we see in front of us didn't arrive here first, but they are wild, so they have nothing to do with the silver monster?" It sounded as if he was relieved that he didn't have to deal with the silver monster. But unfortunately, Freya obviously didn't think so. The premonition in her heart gradually became reality, and at this moment the chaotic clues in her mind became 1,000 times clearer. She raised her head and looked at the three. "I want to know, if these monsters came from here, then where did the silver monster come from?" Brund and Aaliyah's expressions suddenly changed, and even Maynard raised her eyebrows. And it was at this moment that a sharp laughter interrupted Freya's words. As expected of the descendant of the goddess of war, so sharp. Freya suddenly widened her eyes and shouted, "Be careful, Brund, behind you!" "Oh!" Chapter 800. Freya saw Brund turn his head subconsciously, but his whole body suddenly seemed to be pushed from behind. His chest thrust forward, and a blood-stained silver all pierced out from under his breastplate. Brund groaned. His eyes suddenly widened, as if he had been hit hard. He opened his mouth to say something to her, but as soon as he opened his mouth, the blood foam that flowed backward from the pierced lung immediately gushed out from the corner of his mouth. "Don't!" Although it was not the first time she had witnessed life and death on the battlefield, this time was different. This time she was the commander, and everyone's life and death were in her hands. The trust that Brund and the others had in her, an unremarkable commander, was only exchanged for such a cold death. Everything was just because of her decision. This was wrong. She clearly saw the silver monster converging behind Brund like mercury, first the torso, then the head, and in the blink of an eye, it had taken shape. On the silver featureless face, a crescent-shaped mouth seemed to be silently mocking her. It seemed to be mocking her, mocking the commander's lack of strategy and weakness. She had clearly warned him, but it was still a little too late, just a little too late. The pale and calm face of the dead lice, the burning village in the mountains of Yusong, and Brund, whose face was now covered in blood and staring at her with wide eyes, all the pictures seemed to overlap in front of her. Monster! Monster! Freya felt as if the blood all over her body had solidified. She subconsciously and stiffly pulled out her sword. Her duty as commander had long been abandoned. She was like a warrior who felt the burning pain in her face, and wanted to put her life on the line to avenge her companions to make up for her shame. But it was at this moment that a roar came first, suppressing her voice. Monster! She heard Aaliyah, the rough guy who had always seemed to have a problem with Brund, make this sound like a roar. His eyes seemed to be bloodshot, and almost without thinking, he knocked away the giant wolf that was pouncing on him with an elbow, then turned around and slashed at the silver monster with his sword, roaring from his throat, "You damned beast!" This scene seemed to have frozen in front of her eyes, slowed down and stretched, causing her to wake up. Because she was still the commander, everyone could lose their minds because of anger, but only she did not have the right. Day after day, she remembered the days when she was studying in the Royal Knight Academy. She remembered the tall figure who opened the door to another world for her. She came from the countryside of Wuxia. She was a clumsy girl. When she came to a place that she had never heard of or even dared to think about, she only felt fear and uneasiness in her heart. But when everyone around her bloomed with dazzling brilliance, she had to work hard in the quiet hours of the night to memorize the knowledge that others took for granted. Because others were so outstanding, she could only follow suit and work twice as hard as others. But even so, she was still the Cinderella who carefully picked up the long skirt behind the princess. However, she still did not choose to give up, or rather she did not dare to give up. The nobles will eventually give up on Wuxia, because the weak have no right to choose. Freya, if you want to change everyone's fate, you must go to this place. It was like a bolt of lightning in the dark night, and like a voice that only belonged to her, telling her in her heart, Freya, you can't waste your efforts. You have persevered for hundreds of days and nights in the academy. You have done everything that you didn't dare to think about before. You have worked twice as hard as others. Isn't it to prove everything in front of you? You can do it, you are not worse than anyone else. One day, the people of Wuxia will be able to control their own fate and take back the lost land. Brando. This murmur that seemed to be in a dream turned into a serious order when it reached her mouth. Aaliyah, I order you to come back. Brund's mouth was full of blood and he looked at her in surprise. He opened his mouth, but his mouth opened and closed, and he did not have the strength to make a sound. Aaliyah's long sword had already slashed towards the monster's right arm. The sword slashed down and cut open the mercury-like arm like a hot knife cutting butter, but it did not have the slightest effect. As soon as the blade passed, the wound was restored to its original state. The silver monster turned its head, its expression unchanged, or it had no expression at all, only the big mouth that opened like a crack silently mocking. It let out a hollow sneer, waved its left hand, and a stream of silver metal swept towards the knight's neck like a long whip. But the black blade suddenly cut between the two. Dang! The long and narrow blade turned the tip of the sword, causing the stream of metal to completely collide with the ridge of the sword, scattering into countless silver particles like water droplets. Maynard put away the sword cleanly, and then turned back to look at Freya with some surprise. The girl from the countryside of Wuxia's face was still flushed, and there were still remnants of self-blame and regret in her expression, but there was only determination left in her bright light brown eyes. She had seen such a look before in another dream, and occasionally when the clumsy little girl was trying to learn to keep up with everyone's pace. Quick! Retreat! Brund finally squeezed out a trace of strength to make a sound at this moment. I will never leave you, idiot Brund. Aaliyah replied angrily. Protect the commander. Brund's mouth opened and closed, as if he wanted to say this sentence. Freya looked at the young knight who could barely speak and was so sad that she wanted to cry, but she knew that she could not lose her calm at all, There must be a silver lining in a desperate situation. This was a famous saying in Introduction to the Wardworth's War. At this moment the girl's mind flashed like lightning, and all the scenes that she had memorized in the past flashed in her mind and became extremely clear. That monster is coming for me. It wants to kill us. But the pale suns are far from enough. You must not panic, Freya. The silver monster pulled back its blood-stained right hand from Brun's back and glanced at Aaliyah, who was pouncing on it like a mad dog. But it did not care about this humble human. Its eyes were always on Freya, if it had eyes. Aaliyah's second sword came as scheduled, and at the same moment, Brun knelt weakly on the ground as if he had been drained of his strength after being released by the monster. All of this happened in the blink of an eye. Senior Maynard, please go and cooperate with Aaliyah, Freya suddenly whispered. Maynard paused slightly. She did not look back but still asked, "Are you sure what you are doing, Freya? We still have a chance to save Brund." "Are you sure of that?" "I'm sure." The female knight nodded slightly. "You are the commander. I believe in you." With that, she pulled out her long sword and stood up to face the silver monster with Aaliyah on the left and right. Freya opened her mouth, standing in the cold wind. Her fingertips were a little white. She still did not understand why Brando and Senior Maynard would believe in her so much. There were clearly many people in the academy who were more outstanding than her. Why did they choose her, just to play an ugly duckling game? Or was it because they saw their past in her? These were not reliable. Brando might be possible, but Senior Maynard was not such a boring person. She had once inquired about her past. She was so outstanding that no one could be jealous. If the stars in the sky were twinkling, then Maynard must be the most dazzling one. Even if Freya was confident, she would not think that she had anything in common with such a person. And Brando was the same. Other than Senior Maynard, was there anyone better than him? She found it hard to believe. She could not understand a lot of things. Sometimes she always felt that the world was too complicated for her. But fortunately, Freya at least understood a little. For her, there was only one Butchie. It was just a moment of trance, she reacted. There was not much time left for her. She had to make a decision immediately. She looked up as if she had summoned all the courage in her body, calmly raised her voice and issued such an order. "Senior Maynard, Aaliyah, you stop that monster." Then she took out the trombone from her waist, the commanding trombone of the Cruise people, the testimony of the glory of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment. Brund and little Pero gave this trombone to her for safekeeping. It was a heavy trust in itself. Freya did not hesitate. She took a deep breath and blew hard. Woo-woo! The long sound of the horn reverberated through the valley. It was trembling and distant, as if it contained the whispers of ancient times. When the horn reverberated through the mountains, not only did the wolves in the valley hear it, the knights who were fighting alone also heard it. As if subconsciously, they listened attentively. "Knights of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment, don't fight alone. Come close to me and meet at the bottom of the valley. If we work together, we still have a chance to win." A voice echoed between the valley. The girl's voice was steady even beyond her own imagination. Before this, she would never have believed that she could remain calm in such a situation. The young men of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment looked back while resisting the strong enemy, and sure enough, they saw the torn silver flag between the galloping wolves. The flag was still there, and the folded sword was still fighting. The knight let out a roar in unison. "Retreat? Don't even think about it. Don't presume to command in front of me. Who do you think you are?" Only Aaliyah was still roaring. "Brund, hang in there. I'll get you back right away." Freya pretended not to hear what he said as she stared at the monster. Aaliyah attacked the silver monster like a madman, while Maynard assisted from the side. The female knight often did not attack, but just delayed the silver monster's offensive, as if it was really as Freya ordered, covering him to save Brund. The monster seemed to feel the movement on the battlefield. It raised its head, and although there was no expression on its face, the girl from the countryside of Butchie felt the anxiety in its heart for the first time. "Don't even think about catching me, monster. You've lost your chance." She stared at the other party and said word by word. With that, she held the temporary battle flag in one hand and turned to retreat to the bottom of the valley. Among the several people present, only Maynard, who had been paying attention to the movement behind her, and Brund, who was kneeling on the ground, noticed her move. A light flashed in the female knight's eyes, but Brund reacted before she did. "Stop it!" The young knight, who was kneeling on the ground, seemed to shudder. and suddenly let out a hoarse roar. "Aaliyah, or I'll break up with you." Maynard subconsciously wanted to turn around, but as soon as she turned around, a mercury-like curtain had completely separated her from Aaliyah on the other side. Chapter 801. Sensing that the monster was catching up from behind, Freya was nervous but also a little excited. She was like a person walking on a tightrope. In a desperate situation, one mistake and she would be doomed eternally. Usually it was at this moment that she became more confident. Her mind was also clear, and she could unleash her extraordinary potential. So this was the feeling of adventure. However, the monster was very fast. Freya only ran a few steps before she turned around and saw that the monster was already right in front of her. Its speed was beyond her imagination. She was a little anxious. She wanted to take a step forward, but she had to take into account the ambush of the surrounding pale suns. While she was distracted, a pale sun pounced on her from behind. The difference in strength between a silver tear and a gold tear made her feel as if she was hit by a dragon. She was thrown back and rolled a few times before she fell into the snow. The battle flag in her hand also flew a few meters away. "Ugh!" Freya groaned. Before she could care about the pain all over her body, she heard the footsteps of the monster behind her. She quickly got up and rushed over to pick up her battle flag. However, the pale sun that pounced on her did not seem to want to let her go. It circled around behind her and followed her again. That's right, Freya's light brown eyes darkened slightly. She took a deep breath and deliberately slowed down her pace. As expected, the giant wolf seized the opportunity and pounced on her with a low growl. However, this was the moment she was waiting for. She turned her body slightly to the side and passed by the pale sun. The vortex created by the giant wolf's sharp claws almost scraped Freya's cheeks. There were even a few small wounds that oozed blood. However, the girl did not care about that. The moment the giant wolf passed by her, she jumped hard and pounced on its broad back. The pale sun immediately felt that something was wrong. It roared and shook its back, trying to throw Freya off. But Freya had waited so long for this opportunity, so how could she let it have its way? She held the flagpole in one hand and tightly strangled the monster's neck at the same time. Her other hand gripped the pale sun's long silver mane tightly, allowing it to shake its body restlessly. Freya stuck herself to its back without moving an inch. The pale sun was shocked and angry. It let out a low growl and ran wildly, as if it wanted to rely on the bumps to throw Freya off its back. However, its running was exactly what the girl wanted. Although the pale sun's strength was only around the level of gold tier, which was far inferior to that of the silver monster, the level of strength determined one's physical quality. However, in some aspects it was not an absolute difference. Just like how an adult ordinary human would certainly not be able to outrun an ordinary gray wolf, or the difference between a wizard and a warrior of the same level of strength was purely a difference in strength. The pale sun was similar to the silver monster. The silver monster was good at close combat and could cast illusions and many other spells. It had excellent strength and dexterity. Obviously, it was an all-round warrior. On the other hand, the pale sun was a four-legged canine. Although it was a dusk species, it still maintained some of the basic abilities of a beast. Speed was one of them. Freya did not know so much. If Brando was here, he might be able to give her a clear and logical analysis. However, for a country girl like her who came from the countryside of Bucci and had only received a period of intensive training, she only needed to understand one thing. This giant wolf ran faster than her. That was enough. In the wind and lightning, Freya was almost unable to open her eyes. The hair in front of her forehead danced wildly in front of her eyes. Her eyes seemed to be filled with tears, and they could not be stopped by the strong wind. So she simply closed her eyes and held tightly onto the mane of the pale sun. This ferocious monster became more and more manic and restless. When it was unrestrained, it almost left the ground with its limbs. When it was shaking violently, she almost coughed loudly every time it hit the breastplate. There were a few times when she almost lost her grip and was thrown out. Fortunately, she took the time to look back and saw that the silver monster was already far behind her. Although she was a little curious as to why that thing hated her so much, even so it was still following her from afar. It seemed to have said something like "Goddess of War." Freya also remembered that Brando seemed to have said the same thing to her. However, Wone did not have a goddess of war. Whether it was the people of Cruz, the people of Erewhon, or even the gods worshipped by the Wind Elves, there was only the existence of the Dragon of War. But soon she did not have time to think about these details. The pale sun had brought her across more than half of the battlefield, and was about to reach the bottom of the valley. The girl and the wolf were like a gust of wind as they passed through a few positions that were fighting with other giant wolves. Freya squinted her eyes and forced herself to look forward under the strong wind. In front of her was the bottom of the glacial valley. She suddenly gritted her teeth. One of her hands tightly held onto the silver mane of the giant wolf, and the other hand finally let go of its neck. When they passed by a piece of soft snow, Freya gritted her teeth and inserted the war flag into the ground. "Knights, come to me!" Freya's shouts echoed around the mountains, and the war flag stood firmly at the bottom of the valley. However, under the encirclement of the wolves on the battlefield, it was impossible to see what was under the flag. At the same time, the moment the war flag was inserted, the pale sun had already carried the girl from the countryside of Bucci into a narrow glacier crevice. Freya subconsciously wanted to touch the horn tied to her waist. She was afraid that her shouts could not be heard by others, but it was at this moment that the pale sun suddenly jerked, and the horn flew out of her hand. Freya was almost stunned. That was the token of the folded sword knight order. Little Pero and the others repeatedly told her to take good care of it. She did not expect that she would lose it at this time. She stared dumbfoundedly as the horn flew out and hit a piece of ice and broke into several pieces. She was extremely frustrated. "You evil beast!" The girl could not help but scold anxiously. But the giant wolf was now even more dissatisfied than she was. No one would be happy if they ran for several miles with a little mouse on their head without being able to shake it off. At this time, it finally felt that the woman on its back loosened her grip a little. It suddenly stopped galloping, and at the same time its whole body swung to the side. From extreme movement to extreme stillness, the huge force generated by the momentary change of state was almost completely reflected on Freya. Before she could finish her sentence, she was directly lifted off the back of the pale sun by inertia. At that moment, Freya did not foresee this change at all. When she felt herself rising into the air, her heart almost jumped out of her throat. But even under such circumstances, the girl's mind was still clear. She still did not loosen her left hand and tightly grabbed the silver mane of the pale sun. Although there was a moment when she almost felt that her hand was going to break, in the end this action saved her life. She pulled the mane and flew in a circle in the air, and then landed heavily on the back of the pale sun. The impact of landing directly made her burst into tears. Even the pale sun couldn't help but groan in a low voice. Obviously it wasn't feeling well either. Of course, its voice was more anxious and uneasy. The little mouse on its head seemed to be glued to it and wouldn't come down no matter what. After running for a few miles, this monster was also a little out of breath, as if it had inherited the common characteristic of this kind of beast. It was full of explosive power, but it lacked the necessary endurance. It had to slow down and even had the tendency to roll twice on the ground, trying to see if it could get Freya off its back. But Freya had been tormented by it, so how could she let it slow down at this time? The monster just showed signs of rolling to one side. She was shocked, and as if she had an epiphany, she subconsciously pulled out a dagger from her boot and stabbed the pale sun's buttocks with the dagger. It was a completely subconscious action, which came from several special methods of stimulating the warhorse that she had learned in riding lessons. Although the warhorse was the closest companion of the cavalry on the battlefield due to various needs, especially when there were no spurs, all knights had to learn some special skills. Freya could be said to have applied what she had learned flexibly. She directly used it on the pale sun she was sitting on, and it worked. The giant wolf almost let out a whine, which was full of unwillingness and anger. But under the pain it really took a step forward, as if to escape the terrible woman on its back, and ran forward. As soon as the giant wolf began to run, Freya immediately began the process of chest to back. The little girl couldn't help but feel bitter, and didn't know if this was considered a self-inflicted evil. This run took a long time. Freya, who was on the wolf's back, only felt the scenery around her rapidly passing by, faster and faster. Finally, the ice walls on both sides receded almost into one, like a light blue curtain of light. She was a little surprised. She didn't expect these terrible monsters to have such speed. No wonder they could easily track them in the forest. Most of the knights of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment were in the gold domain. It was difficult for ordinary people to keep up with such a group of people, let alone track them. Just as she was sighing, suddenly, her vision in front of her was empty. Behind the glacier crack, there was an open valley. The bottom of the valley stretched on both sides of the cliff, and the rock walls were covered with thick ice and snow. And it was at this time that Freya suddenly felt the giant wolf under her become shorter, and its whole body knelt in the snow. After losing its center of gravity, it directly rolled forward and flew out. The girl knight on the back of the pale sun was naturally not spared. This time, the silver wolf's mane that had always brought her good luck could not save her. After a few rounds in the air, Freya finally screamed and flew out, crashing into the snow. Ah! The girl suddenly let out a cry of pain. After a long while, she climbed out of the snow dizzily. She lay on the ground, almost without the strength to stand. It felt as if her whole body was falling apart. Thinking back to the previous experience, she was really scared. She didn't dare to dream that she would have such an experience one day. It was really crazy. Freya didn't know how she made such a decision at that time. It was simply not like her own rationality. If this goes on, I'll become like that guy. She gritted her teeth and forced herself to sit up in the snow. First, she subconsciously glanced at the valley, and indeed, she saw that silver figure in the distance, rapidly approaching in this direction. Freya couldn't help but be slightly startled. She didn't expect that guy to still be chasing her. Just how much resentment did it have? She looked at the pale sun on the ground again. It had completely lost its breath, probably because it had been running for too long and had suddenly died. Ah, how could this be? She was shocked, probably not expecting that she would actually kill a pale sun like this. If she was still in Butchie, she would definitely become the bragging rights of those guys. But now it was nothing. She gritted her teeth and stood up. Previously, when she was still on the back of the giant wolf, she couldn't wait to kill it. But now that this temporary mount was dead, she was a little worried. Seeing that the monster was about to arrive, she couldn't possibly outrun it. Looking around, she had to think of a way as soon as possible. P.S. Here's a surprise for everyone. Guess what the surprise is? Chapter 802. Freya surveyed her surroundings. This open valley was different from the previous entrance to the canyon. At the very least, she could no longer see the towering blue glaciers, as well as the narrow openings and crevices beneath the glaciers. The terrain was no longer complicated and confusing. There were no layers of ice walls, nor were there icicles and ice ridges on both sides. All that was left was the steep cliffs on both sides and the open valley floor. The valley floor was covered with soft snow that had slid down from the cliffs. She looked around curiously as she limped towards the cliffs. Every step she took was deep and shallow. Occasionally, she would pull at her wounds and gasp in pain. One of her pauldrons was missing, and her breastplate was badly damaged. She looked as pathetic as she could. After walking for a while, she raised her head and looked at the snow-covered cliffs. The canyon seemed to have no end. It extended endlessly in both directions. Freya looked behind her. The monster was getting closer and closer. She gritted her teeth, thinking about what she could use. She had left the dagger on the pale sun, and she forgot to take it off when she left. But even if she took it back, it wouldn't be of much use in such a situation. The only weapon she had was the Lionheart sword that she had been carefully protecting, as well as some miscellaneous items. She opened her waist pouch. It was filled with a few days' worth of dry food, but it had long been frozen to the point that it was almost as cold as iron. Below it was a bottle of wild berry jam. This was something that the Roman had made for her. Even Brando did not have it. However, Freya had always politely declined this kind of thing. It was not a joke. The merchant lady's cooking had always been on the same level as the old witch in the fairy tales. It was not that she did not know how to make it. It was purely because she often had whimsical ideas to add things that were beyond the norm. Next was the explosive crystals that Amandina had given her. There were a total of 6 of them. Originally, she and Brando had 3 each. However, Brando did not have much use for them, so he gave them all to her before they left yesterday. This way, she could better deal with unexpected situations during the ambush. Looking at these things, Freya touched the ring on her hand. Her heart calmed down slightly. This ruby ring was first given to her by Brando. When she left Bragg's that day, she was worried about Brando's safety, so she returned the ring to him. After a year, when Brando met her again, his strength was no longer the same as before. Naturally, he no longer had any use for the ring, so he returned it to her. This ring had changed hands between the two a few times. It had a deeper meaning to her. Looking at it now, the only things that she could use were the explosive crystals in this ring. The ruby ring could cast a fireball spell once. She had already used it once during the battle yesterday. Right now it was about to be fully charged. However, it was already proven yesterday that the fireball was useless against the monster. She did not have much hope in the explosive crystals. Freya raised her head. The cliff on the side of the canyon was already within reach. When she turned back, the silver monster had already chased her to the bottom of the canyon. The distance between the two of them was less than a kilometer. To the monster, this distance was nothing more than a snap of a finger. Freya took a deep breath. Nervousness seemed to pervade her heart again, but she suddenly remembered that she still had another thing. She hurriedly opened the buckle on the other side of her waist bag. The heavy stone slab was indeed intact in the pocket. She breathed a sigh of relief. This stone slab was given to her by Brando. She still remembered that when Brando gave her this stone slab, he also said those strange words. What goddess of war, what bloodline, she did not understand. Brando also did not explain it to her. But these things coincided with the current situation. Freya suddenly had a glimmer of hope in her heart. Perhaps this thing could help her out of this predicament. But unfortunately, the girl soon found that this stone slab was still the same as before. No matter how she manipulated it, it was indifferent. Or rather, it was no different from a real stone. It was just that in this weather it had become colder. Freya sighed. More than once, she wondered if Brando had made a mistake. This was clearly just a stone. This kind of stone slab was not rare. In many black markets in Wonde, there were people who would use similar rune stone slabs to trick customers. From ancient documents to rune stone slabs used by the first generation of witches, the only thing they had in common was that they were all fake. Brando won't be fooled, will he? Freya thought about these messy things to distract herself from her nervousness. Even so, she was still trembling violently. When she made this decision before, she did not consider it so thoroughly. But now she was taking a risk. Not only was she putting the fate of herself and everyone's lives in her hands. She did not know if this was a willful commander, but at least she understood this point. When everyone had to take a gamble to fight for the only chance in a hopeless situation, she had to stand up and take on this responsibility. If she failed, she might not only face death, but she might also face suspicion and even bring trouble to Brando. But in the end, she resolutely chose to take this gamble. Brando did not want a mediocre Freya. She was the same. At the same time, she seemed to understand what Maynard wanted in her eyes. In the end, she tried to smear some of the blood on her forehead on the stone slab. Just like in some knights' novels, it was a necessary process to make a divine weapon recognize its master. Although it seemed a little stupid, and she did fail in the end, the stone slab did not change at all. For a moment, the girl could not help but feel a little depressed. But in the next moment she suddenly stopped. Freya quietly raised her head and saw the silver figure in front of her. She did not know when, but the monster had circled in front of her. In such a short time, she did not expect the difference in speed between her and the monster to be so great. But this time she did not immediately retreat or turn around to run. Instead, she slowly unsheathed Lionheart. The girl held the sword with both hands and stood still as if she had calmed down. She looked at the monster with her light brown eyes and pointed the tip of the sword at it. Not running anymore? The silver monster opened its mouth and let out a hollow and mocking voice. You disregarded your own safety and led me to this place. Do you want to sacrifice your own life to save your companions? According to the standards of you humans, you can be considered noble. It's a pity that such actions are nothing in the long flow of time and the entire world. Your choice is destined to be meaningless. Freya quietly listened to the monster's mocking words and took the opportunity to slowly calm the pain in her body. She was unmoved and only quietly replied, "Cut the crap, monster." This answer stunned the monster for a moment, and then it laughed maniacally. What are you trying to say? You don't really think that you are the goddess of war, do you? You just have a rare and mottled bloodline in your blood. But that means nothing to you. The silver monster replied contemptuously. All right, little girl, the game is over for you. It raised its hand and its right arm turned into a silver blade and swept towards Freya. Freya had seen this move before. She raised her sword with both hands and blocked the attack. Unfortunately, she had calculated the strength of her sword, but not the difference in strength between her and the monster. As soon as the lionheart came into contact with the monster's right arm, she immediately felt that something was wrong. A force that could topple mountains and overturn seas came from the point of contact. Before she could even react, she was slammed into the snow. Freya crashed heavily into the snow. Although the snow was soft, this impact was more violent than any she had experienced before. She could almost feel the deformation of her breastplate, pressing against her ribs and then breaking them. The broken ribs pierced into her lungs, and the girl could not help but spit out a mouthful of blood. Ugh! Freya spat out a mouthful of blood, but she endured the intense pain and instinctively rolled to the side. As expected, the monster turned its blade into a whip and lashed the spot where she was originally at, causing snow to fly everywhere. The silver monster did not expect a mere silver tear to be so sharp. It was stunned for a moment before it realized that those were all the tricks that it had used before. However, the little girl in front of it had already memorized them by just looking at them. Since it had realized this, it immediately changed its move. It simply turned its right hand into a spear, and threw it in the direction where Freya was rolling. It had calculated in advance that Freya would not be able to avoid the attack. However, a dazzling light suddenly shot out from the snowy ground, and a pair of golden wings bloomed from it. With a light flap of the wings, Freya was lifted off the ground and dodged the attack by a hair's breadth. An incomplete form of the goddess of war? The silver monster raised its head. Freya had already flapped her wings and flew into the air. Her eyes were filled with silver light, and the mark of the goddess of war on her forehead flashed once again, shining brightly. She had inadvertently displayed this power in the night tournament before, and then used it again in the battlefield of Ampere Seal. This was the third time she had activated the mark of the goddess of war in actual combat. This time she was obviously much more skilled than the previous two times. Ever since she received the Power Stone from Brando, her strength had improved by leaps and bounds. After entering Milo's breath, in fact, she had already entered the upper silver-ranked level, and now she had leaped into the gold-ranked level, although it was with the help of an external power. While the silver monster was slightly stunned, Freya did not dare to delay. She flapped her wings, turned around, and flew directly in the direction of the cliff. Trying to run. The silver monster did not expect the human girl to start fleeing again while it was stunned. It could not help but be shocked and angry, and hurriedly chased after her. However, after the transformation of the goddess of war, Freya's speed was much faster, and soon she was close to the cliff. The moment she was close to the cliff, Freya suddenly paused and circled in the air, from the left side of the silver monster to the right side of the cliff. The monster raised its head, as if it immediately understood the girl's intention. It was shocked and angry. You dare? Freya did not even look at this guy. Of course, this girl from the countryside of Bucci was very nervous at this moment. She was afraid of missing a step, and did not dare to answer any questions, let alone mock it. She swept across the white snow and circled behind the monster. Then she raised her hand, and the ruby ring on her right hand shone brightly. Flame! An unfamiliar word came out of her mouth. The ring lit up, and a fireball the size of a washbasin roared out. The fireball did not have any attack power against the monster, but this did not mean that it was not powerful. In fact, when the fireball left a long trail and directly shot towards the cliff above the monster's head, it quickly showed the true horror of this spell. The place where the fireball hit was a thick layer of snow, and the spell just happened to explode at the bottom of the cliff that supported the snow. When the fireball exploded, it produced a huge fireball that almost instantly cracked the cliff, and the snow above rolled down. It looked like an abnormal avalanche was about to happen. But this was not the end. When Freya swept across the snow, she threw the 6 exploding crystals one by one on the pile of snow. When the fireball exploded, it produced a violent magic fluctuation that instantly ignited these unstable energy polymers. At that moment, the cliff suddenly lit up with several bright balls of light, and the sound of the explosion almost shook the entire valley. The cliff that supported the snow suddenly collapsed, and the thousands of years-old ice on top of it rushed down like a flood, straight towards the silver monster. Damn it! The silver monster finally let out an angry scream. But Freya suddenly widened her eyes. Because the roar of the monster was not because of panic, but because of anger from being teased. It quickly lowered its head, and 4 long mercury strips extended out from its back like water droplets. These metal strips in the blink of an eye turned into 2 pairs of long silver wings. It can fly. Oh no! The girl's heart was cold. P.S. Is this a surprise? Equals ha ha ha. Today's mini-update will be 7,000 words. How much will it be tomorrow? Chapter 804. The avalanche was like a raging wave coming down head-on, but the silver monster had already spread its wings, flapping its silver wings rapidly like a dragonfly, and then it rose from the ground. The silver monster rushed straight towards her. Freya did not need to calculate to see that with the current speed of the avalanche, the monster could almost certainly avoid it. At that moment her thoughts flashed like lightning, and almost subconsciously, the girl made a decision. The golden wings of light expanded behind her, and she also rose from the ground, and then suddenly rushed towards the silver monster. At that moment, on the silver monster's featureless face, the mocking smile on its big mouth that was like a crescent moon finally froze on its face. "You're crazy!" It screamed in panic. Freya was like a golden meteor, crashing head-on into the silver monster in mid-air. The monster frantically waved its silver blade, trying to force her away. But she was unmoved, did not dodge, and still let the blade cut through her lower abdomen. The half-body armor of the Wind Empress was almost like a thin layer of paper under such an attack, instantly opening a long gash, and rose-colored blood sprayed out. But the girl slammed into the silver monster's waist, pushing it back. Her strength was far inferior to the other party, but at this time there was no need to fight to the death. It was just a momentary obstruction, but it could already decide a lot of things. No! The silver monster's upward momentum only paused for a moment, and the avalanche came crashing down. Ordinary things were as humble as dust under the invincible power of nature. Freya and the silver monster flashed in the snow waves and disappeared. At the other end of the canyon, the battle between the young people of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment and the Pale Sun was entering a white-hot stage. Relying on the guidance of the battle flag planted by Freya, the knights finally gathered together. Their strength was not inferior to these monsters and even stronger. It was just that the Pale Sun relied on the advantage of surprise attacks and numbers to gain the upper hand for a while. And when the Folded Sword Knight Regiment gathered together, and the giant wolves in the forest on the other side lost the command of the silver monster, the battle situation immediately changed. The knights began to fight in the narrow advantageous position of the canyon, and planned to resist the attack of the winter wolves. After both sides suffered a lot of losses, the battle also turned from a surprise attack into a stalemate. This was good news for the humans who were at a disadvantage at first, but the waves of attacks from the Pale Sun still made them tired. After Brund was snatched back by Aaliyah and Maynard, he had already fallen into a coma. Maynard wanted to find Freya, but she was surrounded by wolves with the others, and obviously could not get away for a while. Little Pero brought Rollo and the others back from the other side. Their losses were even heavier. Almost everyone was injured, especially after a night of pursuit. At this moment, even the most tenacious Kurlutzians could not help but gasp for breath. Everyone's expression didn't look too good. However, Rollo stared at the other side of the canyon nervously. "Did you hear something?" Little Pero asked immediately when he saw his expression. He knew that Pero was a mountain man, and among all the people here, his perception was the sharpest. "I think I heard an explosion." Pero's forehead was full of cold sweat, which was caused by excessive physical exertion. His eyes were a little gray, but after listening for a while, he still answered weakly. "Is it reinforcements?" Someone asked loudly. "I'm afraid it's impossible. It was Miss Commander who made it." Little Pero shook his head and replied. Maynard frowned. She knew that Freya had the explosive crystal and the ruby ring on her. Freya had left for at least a quarter of an hour, and there was no news of her so far. The monster did not look back. She knew very well the gap between Freya and the monster. Even if Freya had activated the mark of the Valkyrie, it would not be much harder for the monster to deal with her than it was for Aaliyah and Brund. It was not a battle on the same level of power at all. I think you better worry about yourselves first. Aaliyah was covered in blood as he sat next to Brund, panting heavily. The new wounds on his body were left when he rescued Brund. If the wounds left on him by the pale sun last night were only a small memorial, then he could be said to have received a 1-ton medal at this moment. Aaliyah had completely lost his combat effectiveness, and if the Folded Sword Knight Regiment were to evacuate at this time, he and Brund would have to stay here. But even so, it did not change his temperament. He was as annoying as ever. This guy was as jinxed as ever, but this time things did not develop as he expected. Suddenly, the knight in front let out a cry of surprise. Little Pero seemed to feel something and immediately separated the human wall and walked out. He saw a strange scene playing out in front of everyone. He saw that the pale suns near and far suddenly staggered and stopped on the path of attack. They seemed to be drunk as they fell to the ground one by one, and then black smoke rose from their bodies as if they were evaporating in broad daylight. They turned into ashes little by little, and finally, only black magic crystals were left in the snow. This scene did not just happen to one or a group of giant wolves, but hundreds of pale suns near and far fell to the ground at the same time, then turned into black smoke and dissipated. Such a spectacular scene stunned almost every knight present. As expected, these monsters are all summoned creatures. Little Pero immediately reacted. Looks like our commander has done something incredible. He turned his head and looked at Maynard, but the female knight's face did not show the slightest relief. She slowly took out the communication crystal from her collar. The communication crystal was gray, representing Freya's end, which did not light up because of her infusion of magic. However, in the canyon, Freya's communication crystal, which was scattered next to a pile of snow, was indeed glowing. This meant that someone was trying to establish contact with the necklace through the net of law, but unfortunately, the owner of the necklace was not by its side. Freya almost struggled to climb out from under the snow on the other side. She groaned softly. Her physical condition was worse than she had imagined. Bruises and abrasions covered her body, and the blood oozing from the wound on her lower abdomen almost stained the armor under her armor. There was a huge dent in her breastplate, and blood kept oozing out from the crack. The corners of her eyes, nose, and mouth were also bleeding. She coughed softly a few times. Fortunately, she and the monster were on top of the avalanche and she was above the monster. But when the two were swept into the snow, she saw with her own eyes that the monster was sucked into the vortex under the rubble and rolling snow, and she was lucky to escape with her life. But even so, it only lasted for a while. Freya could feel how serious her injuries were. The fatal injuries came from the impact on her chest and the sword wound on her lower abdomen. The excessive blood loss made her dizzy, and her hands and feet were a little cold, especially in such an environment. What made the girl feel most bitter was that she found that her waist pouch containing the holy water was lost in the avalanche. Am I going to die? She turned over and lay quietly in the snow, quietly looking at the sky. She knew very well how far she was from Maynard and the others, and Cruz would not be able to make it in time. She felt that the cold had begun to numb her body and heart, and drowsiness and tiredness came in waves. Fortunately, I did not fail. Freya sighed softly in her heart. This was the boldest decision and the craziest action she had ever done in her life, but she was not that person. This was the only time and also the last time. She closed her eyes and in the darkness, there seemed to be countless spots of light. These spots of light gathered one by one, and the shadow of the mountains of Bucci appeared, and then gathered to form the face of that person. Brando. Freya's heart was peaceful, and she quietly waited for the moment to come. But the heavens did not seem to want to give the girl this special honor. Just as she closed her eyes slightly, there was a soft cracking sound in the snow. The sound was not loud, but to Freya, it was no less than a clap of thunder. She abruptly opened her eyes and struggled to turn her head. Sure enough, she saw a gray arm sticking out from under the snow. How is this possible? Freya whispered in her heart. Under the snow, there could not be a second person other than the monster. She subconsciously reached out to grab the Lionheart sword, but the monster's reaction was faster than her. With a loud bang, as if a huge force had exploded from under the snow, A black shadow shot out from under the snow, and instantly pressed down on Freya. The silver monster had one hand around Freya's neck, and the other hand pressed down on her hand that was holding the sword. It lowered its head, and coldly looked at the human girl who had made it so miserable. Compared to Freya, it was indeed more miserable. At this moment it was no longer as glorious as before, and there was only one wing left on its back. Its mercury-like body was no longer smooth and flawless, but was now covered with potholes and scars. Its originally silver skin was now extremely dull, and almost turned into a metallic gray color. Freya had seen this color in the battle last night. Usually when the battle reached this stage, the monster would choose to absorb a person's life force. This meant that once it was in this state, it was only a step away from death. That's such a pity, Freya thought helplessly. She could clearly feel her remaining life force being slowly drained by the monster's hand. She could still squint at the terrifying monster, but soon, she felt that even breathing became difficult. Freya's breathing gradually quickened. The silver monster sneered. "Your race is as cunning as they were thousands of years ago." It squatted down beside Freya, and then grabbed the girl by the neck and lifted her up, as if it wanted to enjoy the scene of Freya dying from lack of oxygen. But it was this action that caused the stone slab in Freya's pouch to fall out with a thud. The silver monster was slightly stunned. It looked at the stone slab and seemed to be surprised. "What is this? Wait, this is..." It instinctively picked up the slate with its other hand, but just as it let go of Freya's sword, the girl, who had been waiting for a long time, used the last of her strength to yell, "Monster!" She held the sword with both hands and stabbed at the monster's lower abdomen. Perhaps the silver monster noticed Freya's action, or perhaps it did not expect it at all, and the sword sank directly into its abdomen. It was slightly stunned. It raised its head and looked at the human girl in front of it with a strange expression. "You don't think this kind of scrap metal can hurt me, do you? The attacks of you mortals have no effect on me." It patted the girl's face mockingly. "Ignorant." Freya's narrowed eyes were only left with raging anger. She stared at the monster's faceless face, and looked at the crescent-like mouth that was sneering, and wished that she could kill it with a single strike. But in the next moment, her prayer seemed to be heard by an unknown god. Suddenly, the silver monster's crescent-like mouth drooped down. It was as if an unusually painful expression appeared on its face. It suddenly screamed, threw Freya away, covered its wound, and frantically retreated. The lionheart sword in its lower abdomen suddenly emitted raging flames, and the flames followed the wound and burned its entire body. "This is impossible," the monster wailed as it knelt on the ground. "Damn the mark of the goddess of war." "Ah!" The silver monster turned into a ball of fire in the blink of an eye, but unfortunately, Freya did not get to enjoy the results of her battle. The moment she was thrown to the ground, she felt a blazing flame spreading from her heart to her entire body, and instantly she was in great pain. But Freya did not say a word. Instead, her eyes were filled with disbelief, because she knew what this meant. The golden flame had been ignited, and beside her, the stone slab in the snow bloomed with the most dazzling light at this moment. I'm so excited that I forgot to say the name. Blackie's book title is Calamity Descends, Forceful Push. Today is the day of the ranking. Everyone help to support. Throw in any recommendations you have. Chapter 805. Everyone doesn't seem to trust my integrity. I'm very sad. I've decided to write a new chapter to condemn everyone. Continue to recommend Blackie's Calamity Descends. I don't believe he can write a new chapter today. The traces of artificial carvings were immersed in the darkness. Rows of pillars extended in front and back at equal intervals. Looking up along the narrow radial embedded in the cliff, these pillars shortened one by one at the far end of the field of vision and overlapped together. The smooth wall seemed to be paved with obsidian, but it was covered with a lattice network used to transmit energy. It was no different from what Brando had seen under Valhalla, and it was no different from the material of the remains of Milos scattered in the glaciers on the ground. In fact, such materials could be seen everywhere in the ruins of Wound, and the only thing players knew about them was that they came from the previous era. It looked like a long corridor, and in a past era it might have been called that. But now, only half of the corridor remained. No one knew what kind of disaster it had experienced, but it was cut in the middle, and on the other side was only a bottomless abyss. The corridor was embedded in the precipice, winding to the ground. In the game, this was called the Cold Corridor. A group of people was slowly passing through this half of the corridor that came from before the previous era, or even the era of chaos. In this group, a blonde girl was holding the face of a chubby little man next to her and leading the group. It was Alaz and Sheeta. Brando and Veronica followed closely behind, while the scholar girl followed closely behind the female commander. When the frost-covered road became dangerous, she no longer asked Brando some strange questions from time to time. In fact, everyone became more careful. A body's distance behind the three of them, Scarlet was carrying a bag taller than herself. She did not say a word, but her waist-length crimson ponytail occasionally swayed slightly with the girl's steps. Of course, there was no need for her to go through so much trouble. At Brendel's request, the Buga craftsman had already cast an illusion spell on the Azure Lance. The Buga people's law enforcers of the secret realm had spent their entire lives studying illusions. They were known as the Guardians of the Silver Holy Wall, and were the most outstanding illusionist in the Amber Sword other than the Thousand-Faced Man. Their illusions generally required an existence 2 realms higher than them to see through the flaws. The spellcaster this time was the leader of the secret realm's law enforcers, one of the leaders of the Silver Union's wizards, Roan. His strength was on par with William's, and other than the Sage of Eloranta, there was probably no one in this world who was 2 realms higher than him in the field of magic. Brando was not worried that Eloranta would come to Erewhon to expose his trick. Behind them was the little prince. The future king of Erewhon stumbled along the way, his nose bruised and his face swollen. If he was still in the palace, there would be servants to help him forward. Of course, that was if the Strix sister was not around. At this moment, the Shire, Hipamra, and Medisha surrounded him, but did not lend a hand. In fact, the youngest wizard mentor in Erewhon's history was snickering, and Medisha could not help but secretly purse her lips. They were only responsible for protecting the little prince from accidentally falling into the abyss. As for the rest, it was probably Brando's orders. Behind them were Lorena and her husband, the eldest prince of Cruz, and a large number of Cruz nobles, as well as a group of witches led by Babasha and the other 2 witch leaders. Walking at the end of the team was the Ash Sword Saint. As the most powerful existence in the team, Mephisto's main responsibility was to be responsible for covering the rear. No one could guarantee absolute safety in this abyss. Even Brando could not say that he knew the big dungeon in this game. Not to mention that he had never really gone deep into this kind of place. Who knew if there would be any changes here in the real Wound world? After gradually getting used to this world, Brando could be sure that this world, also named Wound, was not the world in the game, nor was it a phantom or a dream. Although he once wondered if someone had played a malicious joke on him, or if this was a Truman's world, as time went by, he no longer held any illusions and began to call this world the real Wound. The laws of operation of everything in this world were more in line with nature than in the game. Although there were some similarities and differences, it seemed more realistic. Although a real game world was somewhat incredible. After passing through the underground glacier, Sheeta indeed brought them to the underground entrance of the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator, which was actually not far from the place where Peya's brother slipped and fell. This made Brendel a little suspicious, always feeling that there was something in the dark leading them here. In particular, Erek obviously did not take this shortcut under the glacier, so why Peya's brother was in this place was worth discussing. It was a pity that the Hunter siblings were still unconscious, and there was no way to get to the bottom of it. He had also heard about the underground entrance of the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator. The part above the abyss was called White Gorge, and it was the only entrance outside the main entrance of the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator. It was divided into 2 parts, underground and above ground. The above ground led to the Jiwei Glacier where the Frost Devourer was entrenched, and the underground led to this cold walkway. Brando slowly moved forward with the team, and as he walked, he placed his hand on the ice-blue corridor pillars embedded in frost. There was one about every 5 to 6 meters, protruding from the wall like ribs. These pillars were cold to the touch, heavy and realistic, and slightly different from the simulated feeling in the game. Although Brando had never been here, he knew this material. When he touched it in the game, there would be a special touch, as if he could feel the tragic war and malice from the previous era. Not only in his hands but even in his heart there would be a chill. This was the atmosphere created by the game's special emotional system. But here there was no such feeling. These pillars were like ordinary stone products, and they felt heavy to the touch. So this is the feeling. Brando had a strange feeling in his heart. Even if this was a dangerous trip for him, the feeling of being able to personally experience the world in the game was very interesting to him. The female commander noticed his unusual behavior and asked in a low voice, "You've been here before?" Brando was so shocked that his hand almost slipped, and he quickly replied, "Of course not." "No? Then why do you look like you're revisiting an old place?" Veronica replied impatiently. This little guy was always vague, and it made her very dissatisfied. "That's because I've seen the corridor here, these pillars and walls." Brando exhaled and replied, "You've seen it before where?" "In the book." For this answer, Brando didn't need to think about the reason, as if it was a matter of course on the forum or in the book. "Today when I saw this corridor, these pillars, they confirmed with what I've seen in the book. When I measured these pillars with my own hands, I understood that this was the case." This reason was reasonable. Although the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator was a forbidden area, it was not that no one had ever set foot in it in history. The Myrnas had once passed through this place, and the Buga wizards and the Mist Elves had also followed the footsteps of the Myrnas to this place. About a dozen years later, the Black Flame disciples occupied this holy cathedral, making this holy cathedral a famous dungeon in the future. Veronica had long heard about this holy cathedral, but she still looked at Brando with some suspicion. Did the Wizard of the Tower really have such a vast amount of information? This little guy always pushed all the reasons to the literature collected by the Wizard of the Tower. The Wizard of the Tower split from the Silver Bugas, and she didn't believe that they always migrated with the literature of the Bugas. It was a pity that the Cruz Empire had no friendship with the Wizard of the Tower, otherwise she would have found a way to verify it. Now, she could only be skeptical of Brando's statement. At this time, Shido, who was following behind the two, suddenly said, "Seeing the things in the book appear in front of my eyes, I understand that this is the case. After all, the written description is integrated with the subjective wishes of the author. Only when you see it with your own eyes can you understand it." Her eyes lit up. This last sentence was the reason why she left the academy to go to Erewhon. "Like the Count, I have gained a lot today." The scholar lady seemed to have understood some profound truth and replied with some excitement. Veronica sighed and felt that what Shido said seemed to have some sense. She took one last look at Brando and no longer continued to question. Brando was relieved, but the shrewdness and keenness of this female army commander still made him feel a little ridiculous. However, he also realized that he should be more careful, so he withdrew his hand and stopped touching anything in the corridor. He looked up. The forum said that this cold corridor was about 30 minutes away, and now they were almost half the distance. The second half of the corridor went from the underground to the interior of the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator. Brando pursed his lips. The second two-thirds of the corridor was the range of activity of the Twilight twins, Mare and Main. He had been waiting for the two black wolves to appear for a while. Mare and Main were the last generation of the Twilight wolves. They were born from Ekka's seventh daughter, Jean Hai. Jean Hai was the ruler of the Moon of Eternal Darkness, so the power of the twins was mostly related to shadow and darkness. Mare and Main looked very similar in appearance. To outsiders, they looked like giant black wolves with long horns on their foreheads. However, Main lost his left eye in the battle with the Dragon of Disaster, so he only had one eye left. There was also a long scar in his left eye socket that could be used to distinguish him from his brother. These two wolves were optional bosses in the Amber Sword, because they were imprisoned in the secret passage under the Holy Cathedral that led to the surface. It was the cold corridor where Brando was now. If you chose to enter the Holy Cathedral from the main entrance, you would not encounter them. As optional bosses to guard the secret passage, Mare and Main were definitely one of the strongest bosses in the first 4 acts of the game. If it was in the game, Brando would most likely want to avoid them, but now he was very much looking forward to the appearance of these two beasts immediately. There was no other reason. When the team had existences like Mare, Veronica, and the little female dragon, Mare and Main, who were very troublesome to the players, were now a moving treasure trove for him. His nominal teacher, Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles, had already stepped into the extreme planes. He was even one step further than he was in the game. Brando had no doubt that he alone could easily deal with the Twilight Twins. The Twilight Twins' drop list was second only to the final boss of this dungeon. The only problem was that these two stupid wolves did not necessarily appear. Brando could only pray that he was lucky enough. For now it was still quiet all around. Only the creaking of everyone's footsteps on the ice and snow could be heard. He pursed his lips and looked around. Hipamra and Lorena behind her held torches in their hands. Except for the flickering light of the torches that could illuminate a small area, the end of their vision was pitch black. And it was at this time that he saw Alaz pulling Shitoa's ear to stop. The little female dragon stopped because she found a door in front of her. She narrowed her golden eyes and looked at the stone door. To be exact, it was not a complete door because, like the cold corridor, this stone door only had half of it left. The other half of it may have been broken along with the corridor in the past and fallen into the abyss below in a disaster. The rest of it was also shattered, leaving the broken part stuck in the corridor. The little female dragon turned her head and looked at Shita. "What's behind this and why is there a door here?" "How would I know?" The little fat dragon muttered in dissatisfaction. "I've never been inside this temple. My task is only to lead you to the entrance under the glacier." "That's what you promised him. I don't care. You have to find that awakening god who's pretending to be a ghost. Also, you have to find the heart of the dragon that you lost." Alaz ordered unreasonably. "Wait, Sister Alaz, that's not the heart of the dragon. What does the heart of the dragon have to do with me? I mean, you have to get that fun toy back for me." The little female dragon bared her teeth and glared at Shita. The latter shuddered and immediately shrunk his neck and did not answer. Brando heard the conversation between the two and automatically ignored the latter part. However, Alaz seemed to be very interested in the awakening god, which made him a little suspicious. Was it because of her own interest or was it because of other reasons? Alaz was a young dragon and was very undisciplined in her actions. However, the dragons had always shouldered special responsibilities in the game as the Golden Race. At least they had fought against the Dusk. Not only the Golden Race, as far as Brando knew, the Bugas had also built many monitoring stations to monitor the borders of order in the Black Forest. According to Medisha, the Silver Elves were not completely indifferent to worldly affairs. Otherwise they would not have returned to Wone because of the arrival of the Great Demonic Wave. It seemed that except for the Black Dwarves, the ancestors all acted for their own purposes. Thinking of this, Brando could not help but look at Alaz again. Alaz was in front instructing Shita to push the stone door. Although the stone door was heavy, it was nothing to the dragons. The broken stone door retreated under Shita's round claws, revealing half of the hall behind. Or rather, it was more like a square, because most of the ceiling had collapsed, and although only half of the hall was left, it was still ridiculously large. There was a square with a fountain outside Erwin's golden silk palace, but compared to the remaining half of the hall, it paled in comparison. Brando and the others stood outside the door of the hall, and could barely see the other side of the hall. Brando saw this and suddenly realized where they were. At this time a shadow flashed behind the door, and Shita suddenly screamed as if he was hit by something head-on. He turned into a ball and rolled back until he hit a pillar. "Who is it?" The little female dragon's shocked and angry voice came from the front. Although she often bared her fangs and brandished her claws at Shita, that was an internal dispute of the dragons. Dragons were proud creatures, and not just anyone could bully them at will. Especially this thing that actually sent Shita flying in front of her. It was simply unbearable. However, the black shadow jumped back and stopped. Only then did the people behind clearly see that it wasn't a person, but a wolf. A male wolf. Veronica could not help but blurt out. It was indeed a bit like the male wolf that Brando had seen in Valhalla. Its physique was like a hill, almost occupying half of the hall. Its soft long hair drooped behind its neck like a black brocade. But the only difference between it and the black wolf was that it had a long horn on its forehead. The horn was dense with black smoke, and one could tell at a glance that it was not an ordinary thing. This is not a male wolf, this is a dusk wolf. Brando was pleasantly surprised. The bosses in the Amber Sword were more intelligent, and he was really worried that these two beasts would not be fooled and appear. But stupid wolves were stupid wolves, and since Mare appeared, then the one-eyed mane must not be too far away. And at the same time he also knew where this place was. The Hall of Traps. When the little female dragon saw the beast in front of her, she immediately roared and pounced. She could feel that the strength of this twilight great wolf was about the same as her own, but she was a dragon, one of the races that were best at fighting among the golden races. In Allah's mind, no matter how powerful this stupid wolf was, it could not be stronger than her, and she needed to, whether it was to protect her unquestionable authority in front of Sheeta, or the pride of the dragons, she needed to be the first to rush up and teach this uninvited guest a lesson. But she did not expect that just as she was about to pounce, Brando behind her realized that things were not going well. He wanted to warn her, but unfortunately, the little female dragon moved too quickly. As soon as the latter moved, layers of green lightning appeared on the ceiling and floor of the hall. These lightning bolts seemed to have a life of their own. As soon as they appeared, they went straight for Allah's. The dragon race had a passive talent, resistant scales. Dragon scales were extremely resistant to both magic and physical attacks. 1 or 2 lightning bolts would have no effect on Allah's at all. But at this moment there were thousands of lightning bolts, almost like a stormy sea, directly drowning the little female dragon, leaving only a scream. Brando could not help but cover his face. Why else did she think this place was called the Hall of Traps? Chapter 806. Moral integrity has been delivered, perfectly picked up, touched. Catastrophe Descends is being promoted by Sanjiang this week. If anyone has any recommendations, please go support them. Why are you so cool? Alaz sat on the ground with smoke curling up, and no one dared to approach her. The little female dragon's golden eyes were burning with anger, and people suspected that she would turn into a dragon in the next moment and vent her anger on them. Brando also wisely kept his mouth shut. If he now told her that this was actually called the Hall of Traps, a famous scene in the game, and that 1/3 of the difficulty of the battle with the Twilight Twins was counted in this hall, then Alaz would definitely think that he must be mocking her. What a joke! The little female dragon's temper was not very good. At this time, if he said that, maybe she would really turn into a dragon and eat him. Brando raised his eyebrows after serious consideration, and decided to keep his mouth shut. Mare was already dead, and that was the consequence of angering a dragon. Alaz and the Twilight Twins were comparable in strength, but the bad thing was that Mare did not expect the furious Alaz at all. But when the little female dragon suddenly turned into a golden dragon and slapped the black wolf away, the wolf may not have had time to react, and it was already rolling down the abyss. The speed was so fast that it could be said to be the fastest boss to die in the Amber Sword. Brando came to the edge of the cliff and glanced at the place where Mare fell. It was a pity that was half the fall and it was gone just like that. And at this time he heard a cold voice ask, "What did you say that beast was called?" It was Allah's voice, and his heart suddenly thumped. He did not intend to provoke the little female dragon in a rage, but the latter did not seem to intend to let him go. Mare Fess, the Twilight Twins of the Twilight Wolves. Allah suddenly giggled, and immediately made Brando feel a little creeped out. He even began to wonder if the little female dragon was electrocuted by the lightning trap to the point that she became deranged. But the latter narrowed her golden eyes and replied, "The legendary leader of the Twilight Wolves is no match for me. It seems that I can go through with my coming-of-age ceremony." Damn! Brando was stunned. He had seen arrogant people, but he had never seen such a boastful one. Anyone with a discerning eye could see that Mare was still in a sealed state, and what was exposed was not his true strength. After all, this was the holy cathedral of the hibernator, and if outside, 10 Allahs would not necessarily be able to beat any one of the Twilight Twins. However, he had never heard of what the Dragon Clan's coming-of-age ceremony was like. If one wanted to challenge a monster whose strength exceeded one's own, he could not help but glance at Alaz, wondering if she would really use Mare to complete her coming-of-age ceremony. The Dragon Clan could not be so unreliable. "Why, do you have a problem with that?" Alaz's tone changed, and immediately there was a hint of danger. "No, why would I?" Brando turned away from the edge of the cliff. Of course, this was mainly because he was afraid that the little female dragon would suddenly go berserk and slap him down to accompany Mare. That would be too much of a loss. He moved away from the edge of the cliff, and this movement did not escape the eyes of the Shire. The young wizard attendant immediately betrayed his lord, and beside him the silver elf princess, who was more familiar with Brando, could not help but snicker. Only the priestess of the lofty mountains Hippamera was somewhat incredulous, and asked very innocently, "My lord, he wouldn't do that, right?" Shido also nodded at the side. In her eyes, Brando was already a true scholar of noble character. The Shire could only shrug at these two little girls who had not yet been tainted by Brando. At this time, Brando had already walked to the other side of Alaz, and changed the topic. "Speaking of which, the Dragon Clan's coming-of-age ceremony isn't that childish, right?" "What do you mean by childish?" Alaz was very unhappy after hearing Brando's words, but she saw that the cunning human had already left the edge of the cliff, and could only snort twice. After all, for a moment, she really wanted to slap Brando down too. Did he think that she did not know that this guy was definitely aware of the previous trap? How dare he not remind her? The little female dragon bared her teeth. Since the Silver Age, the number of giant dragons has been decreasing again and again, and the age of adulthood has been lowered. "I'm already old enough to undergo the coming-of-age ceremony, but I have to first kill a dusk species stronger than me to qualify, and then take another test." So it's just to qualify, Brando thought in his heart. It seemed that the Dragon Clan's coming-of-age ceremony was not that childish, but it was actually to kill a dusk species, and not a monster as he thought. The dusk species were very common before the era of chaos. Before the dusk dragon fell, these terrible ancestors of magic were all over the continent. But now, only in these ancient ruins could one see the silhouettes of the dusk species, and the powerful dusk species were hard to find. After the Azure Knights separated the sky, the leaders of the Chaos Army were either dead or sealed. Thousands of years later in Vaunt, their silhouettes could no longer be seen. Alaz saw Brando's expression, and knew what he was thinking and snorted coldly. "Do you think the Dusk Dragon is really dead?" At the border of civilization, in the world outside the Black Forest, creatures from chaos are not rare, and those powerful ones are beyond your imagination. Brando was not surprised that the Dusk Dragon was not dead, and after the Slate War, there were many clues pointing to this evidence. In fact, in a long history, the Dusk Dragon was defeated more than once, and it was entirely possible that it was just dormant, waiting for the next opportunity to revive. Otherwise, if the Dusk Dragon was dead, those followers of chaos who respected it would not be so fanatical. Moreover, Brando also knew that the Dusk Dragon did not have a physical body, but a manifestation of the rules. Just like the world of Wond, where there was order, there was chaos. The two were not only opposite but also dependent on each other. When Alaz said this, he understood the world outside the Black Forest. Even the players of the previous world had not been to. If there was something there, he could understand. Alaz continued proudly, "When Mr. Mephisto kills that one-eyed wolf, I'll take it as the result of the exam. The Twin of Dusk, the elders will definitely pass. Then my results can be said to be the most glorious of the dragons in 100 years. Wait, aren't you the one who killed them?" Brendel's jaw dropped. "So what?" Alaz rolled her eyes. "Do they know? Who will tell them, you? Or those cruise people?" The way the little female dragon rolled her eyes was surprisingly cute. At least this was one of the rare times Brando saw her act like a young girl. But she immediately showed her white teeth to threaten others. What a joke. Of course Brando would not tell on her. There was no benefit to telling on her. No, it was almost certain that he would be retaliated against by Alaz. He could ignore it, but his territory would be in trouble. Imagine there was an evil dragon near your territory, not even a dragon. Alaz only needed to instruct Sheeta to find a nearby mountain to squat, and then every 2 or 3 days the merchants would be attacked and lose their food supplies. That was not something he could bear. After all, the current Tonajul was barely relying on commerce to prosper. If the trade route was hit, it would not be long before it returned to being poor. As for those cruise people, if they wanted to tell on him, would they be able to find the habitat of the dragons? That was not a sad little country like Erewhon, where you could come and go as you please. But in any case, he still felt that it was a bit too strange. Did the dragons not care about their coming-of-age ceremony at all? He stared at Alaz suspiciously. The latter replied slowly, "I can see it as an adventure with you. So this is what it means to team up." Brando could finally be sure. The so-called coming-of-age ceremony of the dragons seemed to be such a child's play. And just when he was a little speechless at the strange coming-of-age ceremony of the dragons, there was finally news that Mephisto and Veronica had joined forces to kill the one-eyed dragon Maine. Speaking of which, this unlucky dusk wolf should be considered an honor, to have a sword saint in the ultimate realm, a sword saint at the peak of the law. and at the same time an Imperial army commander to hunt it down together. In the game, Brando could not count the number of people who had this kind of honor. The messenger was a young knight. This was also at the request of Veronica, because Mephisto was now considered one of Brando's people, so Maine was considered to be killed by the Cruz people and Erwin people together. The spoils were also divided between the two sides. The Cruz people hoped to get Maine's magic crystal and blood. The level of the magic crystal of a monster of Maine's level was quite shocking, almost the same level as the dragon. Veronica also had a good plan, but unfortunately, Brando also knew that Maine and Mare's drop list was also top level, the highest level of the world boss level drops. Although the level itself was relatively low, the higher level drops were not available at his level, so he went with the flow and divided the equipment drops. He asked the knight some simple questions, then took Lorena and her husband to where Veronica and the Ash Sword Saint were. Maine did not escape far, and was stabbed to death by Mephisto outside the corridor at the other end of the hall. This was after the Ash Sword Saint and Veronica had deliberately tracked it for a period of time. Otherwise, with the strength of Brando's nominal teacher, it was afraid that it would have been beheaded as soon as it moved. When Brando came to the side of the huge corpse, he saw that the monster's head had a big hole. Presumably the magic crystal had been dug out. He looked up at Veronica. The female Legion commander was smiling. She must have had a good harvest. She saw Brando's gaze turn and quickly replied, "Little guy, if you want, I'll give you the blood of this monster as well. You know, the Holy War is coming, and the high-grade magic crystal is too important for the Empire." Brando was a little amused by this. Of course he knew the role of the high-grade magic crystal, mainly used to power those top-grade magic weapons. In the Holy War, the Holy Cathedral of Fire would definitely put in all its efforts. This was a fight for religious power. There was no room for retreat. But Veronica's behavior was a little too outrageous. He couldn't help but wonder what level of magic crystal she had gotten. But Brando also knew that the female Legion commander would never tell him. He looked back at the Ash Sword Saint. Mephisto nodded to him and gestured. Damn! When Brando saw it, he couldn't help but curse his luck. It was actually the same level as the dragon crystal. This way the Holy Cathedral of Fire's top-grade war machines would have a source of power. But he was not jealous at all. The high-grade magic crystal did not mean much to him, although it could provide a source of energy for Valhalla's growth. But low-grade magic crystals could also do the same. There was no need to be so extravagant as to use such a priceless thing. The blood is not necessary. I hope the Empire will remember the contributions of Her Royal Highness and I, and not make things difficult for us at a critical time. Brando replied faintly. To be honest, he was not interested in Maine's blood. Although the blood of the Dusk species was considered the blood of high-level magical creatures, and was a material for making many high-level equipment, it was different from magical crystals. No matter how high the level of the blood of chaos creatures was and how much energy it contained, it was still not considered a top-notch material. There was no other reason because it was too mottled, and the top-grade blood was still the golden blood. If possible, Brando had already planned how to get some blood from Alaz. Of course, this plan was a bit unrealistic. The little female dragon's temper was too bad. And now it seemed that maybe Sheeta was more reliable. And since he had the little fat dragon as a top-grade mobile blood bank, why would he be interested in other mottled blood? Veronica heard Brando's answer and couldn't help but shake her head with a wry smile. She understood what Brando was saying, but the Empire's decision was not something she could change. Grafine wanted to revive the kingdom, which was contrary to the interests of the Empire, and the Empire could not change its mind for a mere piece of top-grade magic crystal. Of course, in any case, she would not hand over the benefits she had obtained, so she decided to keep her mouth shut and act shamelessly, which was one of the privileges of a lady. Brendel walked directly to Maine's corpse, lifted its huge claw with his hand, and then turned to Lorena, who was not far away, and said, "Miss Lorena, can I borrow your fiancé for a moment?" The female knight's face was red. "What nonsense are you talking about?" she replied bitterly, slapping Philas hard. And the latter had already come to Brando's side with a grin. In the Amber Sword, low-grade beasts did not have a list of equipment drops, and their drops were generally their own materials such as bones, fur, and blood, and if it was a magical creature, magic crystals would be added. However, high-grade beasts were different. Magical creatures with dark magic would generally collect some magic items, and a few such as dragons would still carry them, while others would store them with magic. The same was true for the Twilight Wolves. Brando knew that they generally hid their spoils in the magic space opened up in their claws. Philas tapped the tip of Maine's claws with his hand, and with a click, something seemed to fall from the air and landed on the ground. Everyone present looked down and suddenly found that it was a somewhat strange golden pocket watch. Why was it somewhat strange? It was because the pocket watch had no cover, and only half of the dial was left. There were only minute and hour hands on the dial, and no hands, but even so it was still ticking as if it was not damaged, or that only half of the gears in the dial were operating as usual. Standing on Brando's side, one could clearly see the delicate internal components exposed on one side of the pocket watch. Some of the gears at the fracture were only left with half, but it did not seem to affect its operation. When Brando saw this thing, his vision suddenly went black. Holy sh**t. He couldn't help but scream in his heart. The elapsed needle, a subdivine artifact, the top drop in Maine's drop list. Philas lived up to his title as the face fighter. With a casual touch, he was able to find the 1 in 10,000 chance. But that was not the crux of the problem. It was something else that almost made him vomit blood. That was, the pocket watch itself could not be considered a subdivine artifact. To be precise, it should be a set of subdivine artifacts. The elapsed needle, the backtrack dial. When these two pocket watches were combined into one, they could be called a complete subdivine artifact. But the problem now was that in theory these two things appeared together every time, but Mare, who should have dropped the backtrack dial, had been slapped into the abyss by a laws. The abyss under the glacier led directly to the sulfur river under the beehive. How was he going to get his body back? He was afraid that he would have become a meal on the demon's plate. Brando suddenly felt like crying. Since he came to this world, the number of bosses he had fought was in the double digits. It was not easy for a subdivine artifact to appear, but he did not expect it to be only half. Only half. And it was the most tragic half. The elapsed needle. Elapsed needle. When you activate the elapsed needle, time will accelerate with you as the reference. You can achieve the same effect as time acceleration. The acceleration is up to you, but it cannot exceed 10 times. When time is accelerated, any time-based effect, such as cooldown, charging, recovery, will also be accelerated. Time acceleration will double the elapsed time of your life. When you activate the elapsed needle, you will lose 1,000th of your total experience per second. Every time the acceleration is doubled, the speed of your experience elapse will also double. Backtrack dial. When you activate the backtrack dial, time will begin to flow back with you as the reference. Time will return to the state you were in 10 minutes ago. All of your statuses, life status, experience, and all other statuses based on time, will be reset to the moment recorded in time. After the backtrack dial is used, it takes 72 hours to recharge. Without the elapsed needle of the backtrack dial, it was an artifact that could delete one's account. It claimed that using it for 2 minutes could completely return you to the existence before liberation. Brando had 1,000 words in his heart at this moment, but they were not as urgent as the desire to rush back and bite the little female dragon to death. Can't we just fight the monsters properly?